compañera de vida. Yo puedo ser tu gran aliada, la que aconseja y la que apaña. Yo puedo ser cualquiera de todas, depende de cómo tú me apodas. Pero no voy a ser la que obedece, porque mi cuerpo me pertenece. Yo decido de mi tiempo, como quiero y donde quiero. Independiente yo nací, independiente decidí. Yo no camino detrás de ti, yo camino de la para ti. Tú no me vas a humillar, tú no me vas a gritar, tú no me vas a someter, tú no me vas a golpear, tú no me vas a denigrar, tú no me vas a obligar, tú no me vas a silenciar, tú no me vas a callar. No sumisa ni obediente, mujer fuerte, insurgente, independiente y valiente, romper la cadena de lo indiferente, no pasiva ni oprimida, mujer linda que das vida, emancipada en autonomía, antipatriarca y alegría. Ser protagonista de nuestra historia y la que agita la gente, la comunidad, la que despierta la vecindad, la que organiza la economía de su casa, de su familia. Mujer libre se pone de pie y a romper las cadenas de la piel. Tú no me vas a humillar, tú no me vas a gritar, tú no me vas a someter, tú no me vas a golpear, tú no me vas a denigrar, tú no me vas a obligar, tú no me vas a silenciar, tú no me vas a callar. No sumisa ni obediente, mujer fuerte, insurgente, independiente y valiente, romper la cadena de lo indiferente, no pasiva ni oprimida, mujer linda que das vida, emancipada en autonomía, antipatriarca y alegría.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Women in Theory. Please introduce yourself in the chat so that we can see you and feel your presence in strange ways. I will post a link to the program so that you can check that at your leisure in the chat in just a few moments. I will now just introduce the first panel of the day so that we can get going. The first panel is Women in Philosophy, and I'm happy to introduce our panel chair, Naomi Waltham-Smith, who is Associate Professor in the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies at the University of Warwick. At the intersection of recent continental philosophy, sound studies, and music theory, her work has been published in journals including Boundary 2, the New Centennial Review, Diacritics, Music Theory Spectrum, Parallax, Parsia, and Sound Studies. She is the author of Music and Belonging Between Revolution and Restoration, Shattering Biopolitics, Militant Listening and the Sound of Life, which is forthcoming in a few months, and Mapping Post-Colonial Paris by Ear, which is also forthcoming. With that, I will give the microphone and spotlight to Naomi. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much, Erin, for that introduction. We have panel. Can everyone hear me okay? Sorry, some muting, unmuting issues. So we have a rather full panel this morning, and therefore, without much further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and also just a reminder to all the attendees that please use the Q&A to gather any questions you would like to pose. You're very welcome to use the chat to note things or to have side conversations, but just note that I'll be gathering questions from the Q&A section. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce our first speaker, Elissa Marder, who is Professor of French and Comparative Literature at Emory University, where she is also affiliated with the departments of Philosophy, Women's Gender and Sexuality, and the Emory Psychoanalytic Studies program. She is the author of The Mother in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, Psychoanalysis, Photography, Deconstruction, and Dead Time, Temporal Disorders in the Wake of Modernity, Baudelaire and Flaubert, and is editor of Literature and Psychoanalysis, Open Questions, and co-editor of Time for Baudelaire, Poetry, Theory, History in Yale French Studies. And the title of her paper today is Antigone. Welcome, Elissa.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Can everyone hear me? You're still there? Yeah, good. First, before I begin, a couple of notes. Thanks to Erin and Kendra for organizing, and to everyone for organizing. Thanks to Erin specifically for making me write this paper, or I think that I should thank you. I hope so. Thanks to everyone for their papers yesterday, and also thanks specifically to Kate Jenks for having read a draft of the paper and for giving feedback. So also I've cut down this paper considerably, and I've cut out all of the references to the criticism. And as you know, Antigone is a big field of study for feminist theory, and that sort of hit the cutting room floor. So if we have time, maybe we'll talk about that in the Q&A. I have an epigraph from Anne Carson's Antigone, and Anne Carson will be present as a voice throughout this presentation. So the first epigram or epigraph is the following. But how can she deny the rule to which she is an exception? Is she autoimmune? No, she is not. My title, Anti-Antigone, is meant to be read ironically. In remarking the negative force of the Greek prefix anti, against or in place of, inscribed within Antigone's name, which means against birth or in place of a mother, I am drawing attention to the fact that Antigone is, above all, a counter figure of the feminine, rather than simply a feminine figure. In the following brief remarks, written as a series of polyphonic choral interventions, punctuated by lines taken from Anne Carson's contemporary rewriting of Sophocles' play, I explore some of the potent paradoxes and consequences that arise from the thought that Antigone is not a woman in any simple sense. As a virgin sister who dares to appeal to a law beyond that of the polis, she is accorded an authority that supersedes her status as a human woman. Instead, I suggest that Antigone occupies the position of a phallic virgin whose sovereign power is inextricable from a certain, primarily but not exclusively male, fantasy of phallic infallibility, a fantasy that is, paradoxically, often incarnated by an exceptional form of femininity. But that is only part of the story. One of Antigone's many ironies is that the figure whose very name means anti-generation has been read by many as a powerful mother figure rather than as a threatening virgin. Moreover, judging by the abundant references to her in present-day works of critical theory, film, art, theater, and literature, Antigone is endowed with a seemingly unstoppable power to generate new iterations of herself. Confronted with current-day conflicts, questions, and cultural impasses, new generations of thinkers, poets, and activists continue to call upon Antigone to re-articulate the stakes and limits of political action, agency, and legitimacy. The reflections that follow cannot do justice to this rich and varied legacy. They are intended merely as a reminder that within the seductive image of Antigone's sovereign, autonomous power lurks a more painful, less triumphant, but perhaps more telling version of the way her femininity affects her fate and what we continue to inherit from her. 1. Antigone never gets old. Sophocles' tragedy endures in part because Antigone, the play's central character, is undeniably awesome. This exceptional young girl has been admired, feared, emulated, and adored for speaking truth to power for millennia. Regardless of whether one understands her actions as having been motivated by chaste sisterly love, incestuous passion, intergenerational trauma, political engagement, respect for divine law, or an ethical commitment to the singular sovereign force of the law of her own desire. Antigone's fearsome and fearless display of defiance exerts a power that remains endlessly fascinating. In Sophocles' play, Antigone is referred to as a girl, a child, a sister, a virgin. She is also described as manly, inhuman, savage, uncanny, monstrous. She is compared to a mother bird who has lost her young. After Hegel, Antigone has become the feminine figure most examined and exalted, both by and in the philosophical tradition. Within that tradition, however, she almost always functions simultaneously and impossibly, both as an example of and as an exception to the general categories that she is asked to represent, whether that category is the family, the human, or the law. For I'm a strange sort of in-between thing, aren't I? Not at home with the living or the dead. I'm going to do that over again. This is Anne Carson. For I'm a strange sort of in-between thing, aren't I? Not at home with the dead or the living. 2. Is Antigone a woman? At the level of the text, the dramatic action, and the characters, her relation to her sex is confused. Antigone herself never acknowledges that the category of woman applies in any way to her, despite efforts by her sister Ismene to remind her of the fact that they are both girls and therefore ought to act accordingly. Antigone's very first gesture of defiance is to refuse to accept that designation. Likewise, when later in the play, Creon rails repeatedly about not wanting to be defied and implicitly unmanned by a woman, Antigone neither responds to his preoccupation with her sex, nor concedes that it has any relevance to her steadfast defiance of his laws. As far as he's concerned, she is a woman. As far as she's concerned, the category of woman has no bearing on their conflict. The only terms she deems meaningful are brother, dead, corpse. After her sister Ismene fails to join her in her determination to bury the corpse, she no longer recognizes her sister as a sister. Her living sister becomes dead to her. When Antigone sings her final lament before being immured in the cave where she will hang herself, she declares she has no living kin, no one to weep for her, no loved one to mourn her death. She makes no mention of Ismene, who has disappeared from the play without leaving a trace. Because Antigone has severed all ties with the living, the chorus calls her auto nomos, which, as Bernard Knox tells us, is a term generally applied to cities, but is here applied in a bold figure of speech to an individual who lives by her own law. Antigone only becomes auto nomos, a law unto herself, at the point of death. Antigone, O one and only head of my sister whose blood intersects with mine in too many ways. 3. Sisters. Although Antigone does clearly identify herself as a sister, that designation is itself confused. Critics have long been fascinated with the odd locution with which the play begins, of common kin, my very sister, dear Ismene, that joins the rare word autadelphon, very sister, with koinon, common. The two sisters are initially conjoined and confused. This excess of commonality issues from their incestuous origins and their common provenance, from the maternal womb that they also share with their 3 brothers, Eteocles, Polynices, and Oedipus, their brother father. The Greek word for sister, adelphe, is a variant of the word for brother, adelphos, which means of the same womb. Later in the play, autadelphon refers to Antigone's brother Polynices rather than her sister Ismene. Antigone is a sister who acts like a kind of brother, and vice versa. Glossing Hegel's reading of Antigone and Glas, Jacques Derrida observes that Hegel never deigns to mention that Antigone is a sister to a sister, as well as a sister to a brother. After showing that the very category of brother is impossible, he argues that the concept of brother belongs neither to culture nor to nature, because the concept of brother implies a structural conflict between virile figures who must attempt to destroy one another, qua brother, in order to take up the place of phallic authority to which they are ostensibly destined. Derrida famously claims that Hegel's whole reading of Antigone is predicated upon his fascination by a figure inadmissible in the system, and that the sister in this brother-sister relation is the vomit of the system. Antigone occupies the position of the appeasing sister in relation to her brother, but she also functions as the political brother in relation to her sister. Antigone thus implicitly intimates that the only viable brother is a sister, and that there is no sister for a sister. In each case, the aim is to neutralize the violence in the brother-brother relation and to elevate the invisibility in the sister-sister relation. Brothers are impossible, but sisterhood does not even exist. Ismene disappears halfway through the play. No one, not even the chorus, takes note of her absence. She is ostensibly alive, but her life apparently does not matter. A sister cannot continue the line. Her disappearance from the scene is obscene. Ismene, we two are alone, and we are girls. Girls cannot force their way against men. Antigone, yet I will. 4. Antigone's first sovereign gesture. Antigone's first sovereign gesture is thus to exempt herself from the constraints of being a woman. From this point on, everything that transpires through the play depends, in one way or another, on her estrangement from that category. Throughout the play, Antigone's identity as a feminine figure is systematically both highlighted and disavowed. Her status as a woman functions simultaneously as a fundamental aspect of the play's dramatic force, while also seemingly to be irrelevant to its larger and implicitly more essential poetic, philosophical, ethical, and political meanings. Antigone, O tomb, O bridal chamber, O house in the ground forever, I was an organized person, and this is my reward. I organized your deaths, my dear ones, all of you, father, mother, brother. When you died, you ask, would I have done it for a husband or a child? My answer is no, I would not. A husband or a child can be replaced, but who can grow me a new brother? 5. Antigone is and is not a woman. She is neither simply a woman nor simply not a woman either. The undecidability underlying her relation to sexual difference implicitly inflects how Antigone troubles the limits of the human. For many of the male philosophers and thinkers who love her dearly, Hegel, Heidegger, Lacan, I am thinking of you, Antigone is more human than human. For them, she incarnates in exemplary and exceptional fashion an essential aspect of human experience. For all three of them, albeit differently, Antigone's feminine difference operates as a subliminal and untheorized intensifier of her as hyperhuman. For them, on the one hand, she implicitly transcends the specific determinations of her gender status, while on the other hand, that mark of difference enhances her status as an exceptional, poetic, and aesthetic figure capable of incarnating essential dramas of human experiences, such as mourning, the work of the negative, Hegel, the uncanny essence of the human, Heidegger, and the impossible as the law of desire, Lacan. Antigone is the only woman worth thinking about because she is actually man at his most impossibly human. Chorus. You chose to live autonomos, and so you die, the only one of mortals to go down to death alive. 6. Antigone is excessively and hyperbolically human. Hegel admires the purity of her sisterly love and the way she works the negative. She intuits the emergence of ethical consciousness. For Lacan, Antigone goes toward ate, ruin, catastrophe, atrociousness, and in so doing goes beyond the limits of the human. Heidegger perhaps says it best when he writes that, quote, as a human being, she not only also belongs to the most uncanny that looms and stirs among beings, rather within the most uncanny, Antigone is the supreme uncanny. While Hegel, Heidegger, and Lacan all grant exceptional power to Antigone, none of them ever questions how the specific ways that she is marked as feminine might affect the universal claims they derive on the basis of her exorbitant relation to the human. Her femininity enhances the visibility of her hyperhuman status, even as all traces of the question of the feminine are effaced from the very philosophical understanding of the human that she grounds. Even though her problematic femininity is inscribed within everything she says and does, Antigone's relation to being a woman or not is not a properly philosophical or psychoanalytic question. Guard. When I sneaked a look, there she was, the child. In her bird grief, the bird in her child-reft grave cry, howling and cursing the poured dust onto the body with both hands. She poured water onto the body with both hands. Antigone. The dead are cold. They'll welcome me. 7. Antigone is terrifyingly cold, perhaps frigidly so. As Ismene puts it in one of the most chilling lines of the play, Antigone has a warm heart for cold things, and she loves the impossible. She inspires awe because she is as untouched by human desire, vulnerability, frailty as she is by human laws. She is impervious to everything that pertains to the living. Contrary to the view of many readers who tend to confuse her ritual acts of mourning, covering the corpse with dust, keening like a bird, voicing her own burial lament, with an expression of human feeling, Antigone does not, in fact, overtly express grief as such. Unlike her sister Ismene, who weeps and sobs openly, Antigone never sheds a tear. She is hard, tough, unmovable. Antigone's inhuman coldness provokes fantasies in her readers. Some of her most famous male readers appear to be particularly turned on by it. Her extreme coldness makes them hot. Her untouchability is a form of power. She escapes their grasp, their ken. She cannot be possessed by them. But that very inaccessibility is the source of the power, beauty, and authority that they invest in her. It is what makes her into a phallic virgin. Despite their claims to the contrary, and both Heidegger and Lacan would argue vociferously that this is a fundamental misreading. Her sovereign authority as a figure who cannot be mastered itself appeals to a fantasy of phallic infallibility. Phallic infallibility is, after all, best incarnated by a feminine figure who cannot be possessed. Lacan is famously enthralled by the power of her captivating beauty. She radiates with an unbearable splendor. For him, that radiance comes from her proximity to death, to the real, to the thing. But that very proximity to death, to the real, and to the thing is only possible because she has been rendered uniquely exempt from the trials of sexuality that beset human women. Her hyper-virile powers emanate from her frigid virginity. She loves, but everything about her love is cold. The object of her love is not her brother, but his corpse. Unlike the men charged with guarding the dead body who needed to stand out of the wind and cover their noses to ward off the smell, Antigone is unaffected by the stench of the rotting corpse. She touches the body without fear. She remains untouched and untouchable by human desire. Autonomos, she is a law unto herself. That law, however, draws its sovereign power from the complicity between death and femininity. The phallic virgin is the incarnation of that law. Antigone is a monster, a bird, a manifestation of dust. As phallic virgin, she is a frigid ice queen and a badass butch. Described as savage, just like her daddy Oedipus, she is a daddy's girl and one scary dude. Curiously enough, even though she clings to her status as an unwed virgin, Antigone has consistently been read as a mother. She is ascribed maternal powers because she communes with the earth, identifies with her mother in death, is compared to a mother bird who has lost her young, and compares herself to Niobe, who turned to stone from grief after losing all her children, frigid virgin and fecund mother. Ironically, the two go together, as they are two sides of the same fantasy about phallic femininity. Glossing Hegel's reading of Antigone and Glass, Jacques Derrida claims that Antigone, whom he here, presumably following Hegel, identifies with Cybele, the mother goddess, wields irony like an all-powerful weapon of powerlessness. Antigone, we begin in the dark, and birth is the death of us. 8. Antigone is unborn. She is not, as Lacan would have it, between two deaths, but rather between two births. In Greek, Antigone means anti-generation or against birth or in place of a mother. Antigone's very name recapitulates the origins of her family, negates the particularity of her existence, and marks her as the figure who is destined to be its end. Her life story was over before it began. As she herself says repeatedly throughout the play, she does not fear death because she is not alive. She is still unborn, born, still dead. Seen in this way, Antigone's defiant actions are cast in another light. She does not merely act in accordance with a sovereign will, she acts out from within and against the history into which she has been born. As Mary Beth Mader has suggested, Antigone's insistence on performing the burial rites for her brother is a performance of kinship that attempts to bring back a lost generational order to the family. For Mader, the burial represents Antigone's attempt to repair the crimes of her family's criminal past. But one can also read her actions as a traumatic attempt to unbirth her brother by burying him and to unbirth herself through the double gesture of being buried alive in a womb-like space and hanging herself with an umbilical-like cord that both brings her back into the womb and reconnects her with her mother, Jocasta, by imitating and repeating her mode of death. Death, who gathers all of us into his old bent arms, in the end is gathering me, but I am alive still. Nevertheless, she persists. Antigone is still very much with us today, bearing unbearable histories, acting up and acting out as best she can. Whether Antigone is understood as appealing to a law that is beyond the human, or read as a figure who exposes fissures within the conception of the human and or the political, she continues to pose troubling and unresolved questions about what it means to be a woman in theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elissa, for that incredibly provocative paper. We'll enjoy coming back to questions later on that. So please, just a reminder, people, please do put your questions in the Q&A and I will start gathering them ready for our speakers. But for now, we'll move on to our second speaker, who is Valeria Campos Salvaterra, who is Professor of Philosophy at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Valparaíso in Chile. Forgive my appalling pronunciation, I don't speak Spanish. She is the author of books Violencia y Fenomenología, Derrida entre Husserl and Levinas, and Transacciones Peligrosas, Economías de la Violencia de Jacques Derrida, and of numerous articles on the problem of violence in its relation to discourse in contemporary philosophy. Currently, she has broadened her field of study to include the use of rhetorical figures associated with food in philosophy, which has allowed her to study epistemological, ethical, and political problems from a new perspective. And relating to this new perspective, the title of her paper today is Women, Wine, and Truth. So please join me in welcoming Valeria. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Erin and Kendra, for the organization. And also I want to especially thank my compañeras of this panel, Elissa and Julia, because for those of you that don't know, we didn't write these papers alone. We built them upon a series of dialogue, debates that took place over a year. So this was a very interesting exercise that I'm sure all of us are thankful of. So Saying this, I'll start. In vino veritas, this old formula is gonna guide, of course, my paper, and as we can see, binds together wine and truth. I propose in this paper a hermeneutical approach to problematize, through the topics of wine, drunkenness, and truth, the marginal place of woman and femininity in classical Western philosophy. I will start with a conceptual statement. Philosophy seems to be essentially concerned with truth. Nevertheless, we cannot state the same about its relation with wine. Since wine is close enough to drunkenness, and drunkenness is especially dangerous in an epistemological way, philosophy has explicitly excluded from its meditations. But wine has not stayed excluded for good by philosophers, neither from the theory nor from the praxis of philosophy. From praxis, since the scenes of imbibing wine have a central place in some of the most canonical philosophical texts, such as those of Plato and Kant. From theory, and this is my hypothesis, due to its connection with the figure of woman. When Nietzsche says that truth is a woman, and Kierkegaard says that women are like wine, the possibility of a deconstructive syllogism arises. Women are like wine, truth is a woman, in vino veritas. A series of deconstructive effects also follows from this drunken syllogism, or this honorologism, for philosophy, which allows us to sustain a stronger thesis about the exclusion of the feminine from the realm of philosophy, the fear of its own ruin. It isn't difficult to demonstrate that wine and everything associated to it, imbibing, drinking, tasting, gustatory pleasure, digestion, inebriation, drunkenness, hangover, etc., have never had a visible position in philosophical discourse. And nevertheless, there are some common points that surprisingly can be found between wine and a particular discourse, namely the discourse of truth in general. I will approach the status of wine as a discursive element in relation with the tradition of truth, and as well with truth as tradition. As a trade, a transference, trespass, interchange, in other words, as some kind of economy. Following Nietzsche, if truth is, quote, a mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms, end quote, then it cannot be determined through any fixed criteria, and as a consequence, it cannot be crystallized in a dogma. Is there any relation between truth as a dogma and the condemnation of drunkenness? Is there any relation between this condemnation and woman? What I like to suggest from this exercise is the following. To track the place of wine in philosophy is one of the many ways of bringing up the decisive moment in which philosophy as a critique becomes a critique of itself. Inebriation poses a paradox for philosophical thought. Although it is a conspicuous hazard for the proper operation of the intellect and its totalitarian government over the body, so say by Plato, at the same time, drunkenness enables access to a certain truth. This may be found already in Plato's Symposium, in Alcibiades' mouth, when he hastily and notoriously drunk rushes into Agathon's home. He states that one makes you truthful and that he will attempt to reach the most accurate truth, helped by this inebriated state. Further on, Alcibiades deplores the sobriety of his interlocutors and compares physical inebriation to Socrates' words. Socrates is the one who never gets drunk, but inebriates the others with his words, just as wine does. And this makes sense since Plato himself acknowledges in another dialogue, the Phaedrus, the proximity among words, drugs, pharmakon, and the charm they cast. Nevertheless, it is important to pay attention at this point to a sort of confession coming from Socrates. Although his discourse about love is completely adequate to his own philosophical approach, he has not been the coiner of this inebriating speech, since he has heard it from someone else, someone that he names as his master. His master, who taught him the most truthful philosophy of love, is actually a woman, Diotima, priestess of Mantina. The power to inebriate then comes from Diotima rather than from Socrates. What Diotima teaches Socrates is actually a certain doctrine of truth, marked by the necessary consideration of the middle term of an opposition relation. We can also say that Diotima introduces the need for ambiguity, a proposal for not reducing difference to contradiction. Because, as Socrates maintains, Eros is neither beautiful nor ugly, he is a middle thing. Just as between knowledge and ignorance, there is correct opinion. So Diotima teaches Socrates something much more extensive than a mere discourse on love. She teaches him to manage difference in a new way that can't be easily tamed by the principle of non-contradiction. She teaches him to appreciate indetermination, and with this, she gives him the real power of truth. The truth, or certain unveiled truth, is secretly intertwined in Plato between wine and the inebriation that it provokes. Wine makes you tell the truth, but the truth is also like wine, inebriating. This later statement is the one that interests us the most in good old Plato's rhetorical iteration, namely, that they unveil always from a hidden gesture that is always suggestive, a constitutive weakness of truth, or better yet, a negativity of truth. Truth is both debilitating and weak. It generates ruin and is ruinous at the same time. And this is probably the ultimate way of describing what Diotima's discourse on ambiguity does to truth. Plato may not have wanted to confess this last point, and that maybe, and this is why Socrates, the one who inebriates, isn't himself affected by inebriation. But the first part, the destructive capacity of truth, is present in many dialogues, including Gorgias, where the truth has only one great function, to be a refutative tool. Truth isn't thus anything of the nature of an entity. It does not have a positive function either. Indeed, it isn't anything at all but the pure negativity of the disruptive gesture that attacks discourses only from the inside, as they can't be constructed on any solid terrain. Socrates is a pharmacist, even a drug dealer, and also, why not, an oenologist and a sommelier. But let's not forget that the ruinous power of Socrates' tongue is not his original property. It was given to him. It was a gift he received from a woman. In the tradition of truth we are reading, there is another great philosopher who wrote on our subjects that is worthy of attention, and it's Kant. Kant himself could not deny this relation between destructive negativity and woman, and he put it in a clear way. Woman refuses, man pretends. Nature wants that woman be sought. This sentence is from the Anthropology in a pragmatic sense, suggests that for Kant, the act of refusing, rather than being despicable, is attractive and even seductive. Women, like truth, are sought by man, even though paradoxically they refuse to be found. They hide, and thus, in the long run, they are forgotten. Maybe some of these reflections can be applied to his considerations about wine and inebriation as well. It is quite clear at first sight that Kant talks about stimulant substances, and his example is Peruvian chicha, in a condemnatory way. Those who consume it for a long time have trouble arranging their sensible representations through the laws of experience. But he also condemned the lack of control over oneself that inebriation produces. Portrayed this time in his Metaphysic of Morals, when he equals drunkards to animals as beings that are only externally controlled by the object of their desire, he also reminds his reader that, and I want to show you the quotes so it's easily. So you see the quotes? Can you see them? Okay. So the first quote, no? Half a century ago, a fraudulent policy was used by the Nordic courts when they sent delegates who could drink much without getting drunk themselves. They made others drunk in order to extract information from them or to persuade them. This practice, however, has disappeared along with the crudity of the customs of those times. That is the quote. Paradoxically, he says this in the context of a surprising and inconvenient apology for the positive moral effects, this time of booze. He says, quote, good-natured is presupposed when this license is granted to a man to cross the boundary line of sobriety for a short time, for the sake of sociability, end quote. So a secret bond emerges between wine and truth in Kant, this time in a way that is specifically moral. The social possibilities that wine consumption enables are highlighted, allowing something close to a social construction of truth. Indeed, every mute inebriation that doesn't communicate thoughts, claims Kant, has something vicious, since social conversation is for Kant one of the ways in which truth appears in society. Truth understood here in one of its specifically moral versions, open-heartedness, if I said it right. So let's look at the quote number 2. Drink loosens the tongue, in vino disertus, but it also opens the heart wide, and it is a vehicle instrumental to a moral quality, that is, open-heartedness. Restraining one's thought is an oppressive state for a sincere person, and merry drinkers do not readily tolerate an overly reserved drinker because he is an observer who notices the faults of others while he keeps his own under control. Very sensible. Kant also, quoting good old Hume, praises forgetting between partners and friends because, says Hume, according to Kant, the follies of the last debauch must be buried in eternal oblivion in order to give full scope to the follies of the next. That is the quote. Truth, but a certain truth that is also historical and intersubjective, that is traditionalized and enables subject to receive and transfer knowledge, that truth is also good nature, that is also good-naturedness, requires a certain forgetting, an experience of the impossibility of bringing the past to the present. This truth demands a consciousness that must make a synthesis of what isn't originally together and bonded, thus the consideration of a mundane time and not only a pure transcendental one. This truth also, like woman, refuses courtship and resists the control of man. So closer to our times, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard have also included woman in this honorologism of truth and wine. Regarding Kierkegaard, it would suffice to mention a brief and brilliant text in Vino Veritas, like our first phrase. A text that talks about an important topic, the secret, but about the secret in its sweetness, in the joy it delivers. Even knowing that for many, secrecy holds an element of danger, Kierkegaard states that it is the very condition for truth. The secret must imply the capacity of remembrance, the simply ability not to forget. But remembrance is not the same as memory. Instead, it operates in a way similar to wine. So here we have our quote number 3. The bottling of the recollection must have preserved the fragrance of the experience before it is sealed, just as grapes cannot be pressed at any time whatsoever, just as the weather at the time of pressing has great influence on the wine, so also what is experienced can neither be recollected nor be inwardly recollected at any time whatsoever or under any and all circumstances. There's the quote. Whew, difficult to pronounce. Remembrance is subdued, Kierkegaard says later, to the fluctuation of chance. But it is, however, and for this same reason, a remembrance of the essential, since the essential is not exclusively determined by its own content, but also by its relation with the interested subject. This linkage denies the possibility of remembrance being a faithful copy of objects and situation, and rather is determined by the randomness of the interests of who is remembering, just as the weather and territory that made the vines grow determines the wine. If truth, in turn, is linked as well to the essential, it is then the configuration and the very expression of the essence. In this case, it too cannot be dissociated from the shifting nature of the conscience that is thinking it. Truth then should be thought in the most radical way possible, starting from the most radical form of remembrance as well. That is, from a remembrance totally unrelated to memory, understood as a faithful representation of the object of past experience. The most alien concept for repetitive and ostensibly mimetic memory will be, without a doubt, the remembrance elicited by the inebriation of wine. Consciousness then will align with memory's most interest state, while remembrance will be aligned with the utmost determination of chance. This could explain why Kierkegaard reunites a group of friends in pursuit of the truth, in whose conversation wine couldn't be absent. Kierkegaard says, and this is quote number 4, the motto for the banquet was specified by Constantine, in vino veritas, because certainly there must be speeches, not just conversation, but there must be no speeches except in vino, and no truth must be heard except that which is in vino. When wine is a defense for truth, and truth is a defense for wine. Later in this narration, the Venus pursuit of truth is connected to the issue of literature and, by this, of poetry, because wine and its inebriation is but one of the forms of poetry, and of poetry as truth. In this new honorologism, poetry cannot be understood as an alien discourse for philosophy anymore. Since both seek truth, they are both determined by the same end. They have the same final cause. Since both have truth as their own topic, they have the same material cause. Because truth also impels them, they share the same efficient cause. Maybe only the formal cause is different. Why philosophy has declared itself to have truth as its condition of intelligibility, poetry has not declared this explicitly. Poetry unbuilds itself and every other discourse that claims to share truth with itself. This leads us towards Nietzsche. In the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, he claims what follows. Quote 5, supposing truth is a woman, what then? There are no grounds for suspicion that all philosophers, insofar as they have been dogmatists, have been very inexpert about women, and that the gruesome seriousness, the clumsy obtrusiveness with which they have usually approached truth so far have been awkward and very improper methods for winning a woman's heart. What is certain is that she has not allowed herself to be won. And today, every kind of dogmatism is left standing dispirited and discouraged. Just as can hold, a woman in Nietzsche is difficult to know. She hides, she refuses, she never allows herself to be won. She doesn't accept the favor of men easily, and we can now suspect she doesn't specifically because of masculinity's inner dogmatism. Philosophers are proper examples of this kind of men, tyrants that force truth submission with violence, whose only end is to create a world adequate to their own spiritual will of power. When Nietzsche coined the idea of a will to truth, closely related with the will to power, that outflows from the tyrannical drive of philosophy, he took the first step towards uncovering the ugliest face of philosophy. Nietzsche's commitment to this critical project takes him exactly to this point, the point at which he articulates truth's femininity, also, as we have already suggested, entangled with the rhetoric. We know that Nietzsche postulates that rhetoric is the essence of language, and by this means, he announces a huge separation between language and the terrain of the real as a focus of justification. This certainly undermines the classic way in which truth was conceived, and it only leaves us with plausibility, in Latin, verosimile, while simile, with the simulation of truth as useful as a base or an anchor point for certain discourses that aren't focused on looking for knowledge, strictly speaking. Now, let us return to the famous quotation from On Truth and Lying in an Extramoral Sense we mentioned above. Nietzsche, by explaining the field of rhetoric, specifically as an art of tropes, to the very limits of language, denies the possibility of a peaceful deduction of meaning and their respective signs from things. In place of this, he proposed to understand language as a forceful operation of violent imposition of metaphors, and the truth as a rhetorical construction whose power doesn't come from anything transcendent beyond its own discursive boundaries. The metaphoricity of language implies an original disappropriation of the word, a negation of what is proper to the name as something that never had place. This implies that the trace left by the thing in our sensibility isn't a mere copy, but a blurry partial outline that barely represents it in its originality. From this originality, only a certain temporal and spatial experience remains, but that must be filled in its form with a matter that doesn't leave a sure impression, that is dissolved, mixed, and confused with the inner affection of sensibility. Hence, language is a creation, a work that imposes itself upon reality, and that in this sense is nothing but a force. So now finishing my last paragraph. Hence, the aesthetical attitude that Nietzsche exalted so much as the driving force of reality itself, as the unique cause of every category that metaphysics pretends to have simply discovered. Hence, too, why the great creators of the world and its laws are, at the same time, great artists. This certainly confuse truth with literature and poetry. And woman, I return to Kierkegaard once more in the quote number 6. From the drinking song to the tragedy, poetry is the idolization of woman. If woman's ideality were in itself inspiring, then the one who inspires will have to be the one to whom he is bound for life. Life expresses in another way. It says, in a negative relationship, woman makes a man productive in ideality. So for Kierkegaard, wine has to do with poetry, and the later with woman and negativity. This negativity expressed the impossibility of the self-constitution of truth without regard to the intervention of something other, of the non-truth. Every condemnation of taste and inebriation is nothing but a way of silencing this negativity, of relegating it to the silence of nothingness. Women are this negativity that stalk man's mind at the time they reject their gallantry, allowing only a weak, ruinous, and bastard creation of the truth. The fact that truth is ruinous and weak doesn't make it less valuable, but allows the concept of value itself to be understood under another light, no longer as a condition of hierarchies, of domination, of violence, but as another form of transfigured value. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valeria, for that, if I may dare, intoxicating paper. Look forward to coming back to more questions on inebriation, and as I'm in the UK, maybe a glass of wine for the next panel. But without further ado, then I would like to welcome Julia Ng, who is lecturer in critical theory and co-director of the Centre for Philosophy and Critical Thought in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Goldsmiths, University of London. She's the co-editor of the Modern Language Notes special issue on Walter Benjamin, Gershom Scholem and the Marburg School, and co-editor with Peter Fenvers of Werner Hammacher's Two Studies of Friedrich Hölderlin, and a critical edition and new translation of Benjamin's Towards the Critique of Violence, forthcoming this June with Stanford. And the title of her paper today is Sapphic Sociability. Please join me in welcoming Julia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just try to share my screen. Okay. All right. So everybody can see that? Yeah, okay, great. All right, thank you very much for the introduction, Naomi. And of course, thank you, Erin, for convening the symposium, and above all, for convening the group, Women in Theory, which I've had the privilege and honor of being a part of since its inception. Before I begin proper with my presentation, I would like to read out the following. 谭小杰, 冯道友, Park Sun-chung, Hyun-chung Grant, Kim Sung-cha, Yu Young-a. These are the names of the 6 Asian women who were killed in the Atlanta area on Tuesday, 16th of March. Their killer, whom I will not dignify by uttering his name, allegedly told the authorities he was motivated not by race, but by a sex addiction. Mainstream news outlets, from the Washington Post to the New York Times, initially reported on this as though it were fact, thereby widely disseminating the notion that those killed were merely sex workers, who not only were somehow therefore deserving of elimination because they presented a temptation, but whose Asianness did not even deserve a footnote within the discourse on the ongoing racial violence in the United States. Moreover, the sex not race explanation seems to have been considered so matter of fact that no one bothered to investigate the background of the quote source, Captain J. Baker, whose comments that the suspect was simply having a bad day were, as was subsequently revealed, only the latest in a series of comments he had made casting COVID-19 as a quote import from China. Last but not least, a final erasure. Experts have been quoted as saying that investigators should not rule out a racial motive, since, quote, you can't ask perpetrators what they think. That's not how we determine whether something is or isn't a hate crime. Sure enough, yet none of the experts cited in the particular article I looked at were of Asian descent. Meanwhile, newsrooms across the country have reported that members with expertise, language skills, and the cultural competency in the Asian communities impacted were not being assigned to cover the shootings, and being told that their backgrounds meant that their bias would show, or that they might be too emotionally invested, as though their white or Black colleagues might not have had their own biases and emotional investments in the story. Meanwhile, also having their requests for more nuanced coverage be rejected. The utter baseness of this problem is illustrated by the fact that the Asian American Journalists Association has felt the need in the year 2021, when there is a Chinese restaurant in every remote corner of the globe, to post on their website a tutorial on how to pronounce and transcribe the names of the victims so as to communicate at least a modicum of respect and cultural sensitivity towards their communities. Thus, a double, even triple effacement, the Asian woman, whether American-born or recent immigrant, seems to throw a figure that is so alien, or indeed so alienated from the very conventions of how we gauge authenticity in the Anglo-American universe, that not even voice, that marker of embodiment so often taken as too personal or too disruptive of rational discourse, is granted her, such that her experience of racism must either fit into the homegrown discourse of racial violence against Black and brown peoples in America or be regarded as completely illegible. Never mind the fact that one of the worst mass lynchings in American history was one perpetrated against 17 Chinese men in October 1871 in Los Angeles. That Asian Americans were very much a part of the World Liberation Front in May '68, and also at the center of the founding of critical race theory of the 1980s. Or that the Page Act of 1875 barred the entry of a group of East Asian women seeking to join their families on the basis of their supposed sexual impropriety. In other words, that the objective of anti-Asian hypersexualization and racism in the United States is to cast Asians, and especially Asian women, as a foreign problem, an unpronounceable problem, an illegible problem that misrecognizes the victim to the point of erasing the very fact of her erasure itself. I mention all of this because as I was preparing my presentation for today, I found myself thinking that while writing my contribution today, rather than starting from a year ago, I would have composed it very differently. And in fact, if I managed to, I would still try to reframe the question of Sappho in light of what I've just told you, because as I realized this week, my interest in Sappho has always been inflected by my suspicion that what went hand in hand with her desexualization at the hands of rhetoricians and philosophers through the centuries was also and inseparable from a suppression of her Asianness. In fact, alongside being cast as hetero-adjacent, be this in the figure of the prostitute or the spurned lover, Sappho is also rendered as Europe-adjacent, as living and dying for the arrivants from the Occident, rather than as indigenous to Lesbos, an island that is barely 5.5 kilometers from the coast of Turkey. Thus, while what I have to say next will seem to have little to do on the surface with my concerns with anti-Asian racism in the Anglosphere, I hope you will be hearing it in its key. Because for one, Sappho has never been anything but a construction engendered from the mispronunciation of a name of someone that someone long ago decided was unpronounceable. This, I contend, goes hand in hand with the rarity of Sappho's appearance in critical theory. Unlike Antigone, for instance, Sappho is no girl, defiant against the paternalism of state politics. Her optics do not lend her to the kind of rallying that, since Hegel has embraced the feminine singular as an exceptional moment within the unfolding of objective spirit. From the millennia of sensationalist biography and efforts by the Christian Church to eliminate her from the written record, we learn that Sappho is a woman with women friends who sang her poems and luxuriated in her passions for these companions, who shared with her a garden on the Isle of Lesbos, separated from the mainland by sea and closer to the shores of Asia Minor than to Hellas. And inasmuch as that is the case, it seems that critical theory has left her out of world history tout court. Indeed, as André Ladinois writes in the introduction to the 2014 edition of Sappho's works, quote, it has become a commonplace among classical scholars when asked to assess the life of Sappho, to refer to the entry on her in Modi Wigtig's and Sandy Zeig's volume on lesbian peoples, which devotes a full page to her, but leave it blank. Sappho is, in theory, treated as a historical existence intentionally recorded as an absence. The garrulousness of the speculations surrounding her person and poetry, fueled by the fragmentariness of her literary remains, has turned her into a signifier of the word's fragility and a most fecund sort of feminine unknowability. Such is Sappho's reach, a signifier of the fragile and unknowable, that on the few occasions when Sappho makes an appearance, she is mobilized as a foil for thinking about a theory's own material conditions, whose effacement, real or potential, is imagined as theory's hypergenerative ground. In Was heißt denken, for instance, Martin Heidegger calls briefly upon Sappho to illustrate a post-metaphysical because pre-discursive and pre-reflexive disclosure of truth, but is then never mentioned again. Her sexuated ontology expunged so as to construct a gender neutrality on which to base the saying of truth. In The Birth of Breasts, Jean-Luc Nancy rehearses the trope of Sappho as the jealous lover, taking her account of breasts that do not exist for her as exemplifying emergence as a, quote, nothing that is supposed to have value all on its own. For Friedrich Kittler, Sappho is the first poet to register the separation of voice and letter because it witnesses the birth of the phonetic alphabet, that is to say, the transition away from Asiatic cuneiform towards the vocal sign, and the very beginning of Western writing, because of the apparent unanswerability of her desire, except in ceaseless division and repetition. In theory, therefore, Sappho signifies Sappho, a philological, pseudo-biographical, and philosophical conflation of mother and jealous lover, transfigured into a self-signifying absence that produces theory by eliminating itself in writing. No emblem of this complex is more fitting than, in fact, the very name Sappho, not the name by which the poet knew herself in her native Lesbos. Sappho assimilates the Sappha of her Aeolic dialect to the Greek of the mainland by replacing the initial psi with a sigma, the conspiratorial onomatopoetics of the original consonant fizzling out in the European modernity. In spite of the fact that Sappha is apostrophized by the goddess Aphrodite herself in the poem's very first and only complete poem, in spite of the fact, moreover, that the letter psi persists in reproductions of the Greek text, 3 authoritative modern translations rename this alter ego in poem 1 Sappho with a sigma, assimilating her Asiatic universe to a Hellenic tradition that her readers are all presumed to inhabit. Sappho's corpus, then, is contrived as being in need of reconstruction if it is to be accessible to us. Hers is the voice of linguistic fragility, the voice heard calling for self-division that has been assumed to be feminine, self-effacing, and yielding to a generalized, gender-neutralized public discourse. Sappho's is also a corpus whose existential horizon is determined by the infinite task of restoring it to its original unity, which thus is historical, completed, and to that extent unredeemable. Sappho's presence in theory marks the place where a whole life is deemed incorrigible and where this judgment prefigures the demand for reconstruction and interpretation. For millennia, Sappho was therefore cast as the prostitute, the profligate lesbian whose works needed to be burned, or the woman and rehabilitated to heterosexuality, only to leap off a cliff when spurned by her male lover. Yet unspeakability and erasure bear witness to subcutaneous disturbances. In Sappho's first poem, one such disturbance is marked by a moment of philological uncertainty regarding its opening line. In some manuscripts, the line reads, Poikolithron Athanat Aphrodita, often rendered as, quote, immortal Aphrodite sitting on the ornately wrought throne, that is, ruling over a manifold, including Sappho herself, the objects of her desire, and their various psychosexual states. In other manuscripts, the first word reads poikolifron, as in having a mind, or phronos, that is, poikilos, which is to say dappled, many-colored, changeful, or when describing Prometheus, Odysseus, or the Sirens, artful and wily. As classicist John Winkler has suggested, the poem does indeed display formal characteristics of such many-mindedness and self-performance of the lyric eye, and of Sappho herself as being artfully in control of her own dappled mind. Thus, philological undecidability provides grounds for speculating on the situation of women's experience in respect to male-dominant public culture. Sappho's self-performance registers less a marginal or restricted sphere of experience than the ability to participate multiply, both in the Homeric world of the myth from which she draws some of her characters, and a sphere that only women know, that is, rendering her sphere plurivocal and infinitely richer than that of any sole inhabitant of the male-dominant public sphere. And if this is the case, Sapphic many-mindedness presents more than the opportunity for women and minorities to occupy a double consciousness with respect to public culture. It unsettles binarism as such. Take, for instance, Kant's proposal for a community of the like-minded in regard to moral judgments, the anxious fever dream of a man who is convinced that he sits alone on his throne and must conjure up a universe in agreement with himself as a necessary supplement to the possibility of his being and acting. The expansiveness that he grants to himself is the expression, in the genre of a necessary presupposition, of the assumption that everyone is in possession of a common and healthy understanding, from which it follows that one may therefore act as if one's interests could be shared by every other individual on the planet, except, of course, for those who lack the requisite common sense. But these are not, for Kant, participants in the collective destiny of the human race. The conflation of logical necessity with the pleasure taken in pleasure itself, that is, in the expectation of being able to take pleasure in the same way as everyone else, regardless of the content of what pleases, all this feeling is concentrated in the as if, which holds fast to the need to choose between the world as it is or none at all, or at best one that is conceivable only by analogy and on the other side of redemption. From the perspective of Sapphic many-mindedness, however, the binary between as if and not as if, the division of the world into moral and non-moral, free and unfree, derives from the solitary man's desperation to feel anything so as to cancel the void in which he has imagined himself necessarily existing as a rational being. It stands in contrast with Karazan's dream, the fictional account of a misanthrope's awakening to his need for touch, which Kant credits in his observations on the feeling of the beautiful and the sublime for his own discovery that a world of outer relations is needed if freedom and history are to be conceivable. The feeling from which this discovery arises, the terrifying sublime, projects at space and time with two notable characteristics. First, it is a solitude nonetheless populated by dreamlike shadows, in the same manner as, quote, the zephyr whispers to lovers, which Kant takes as an instance of imagining life in inanimate matter. Second, the terrifying void that expands the heart through its tactility is devoid of women, who Kant associates with the small, charming, and beautiful. Excluding women from the capacity for sublimity, Kant single-mindedly projects an unforeseeable future from which he then derives his insights, that it is better to live alongside the immoral than no moral beings at all. The touch of this projection awakens a taste for sociability between equals who need yet repel one another. Meanwhile, women are crowded into the non-moral and eventually merely procreative domain. By contrast, the sweet-toned breezes of which Sappho sings in fragment 71, for instance, etch out a space populated by lovers who, unlike those whispered to by Kant's imaginary zephyr, exist not in a necessary bit of unreality to be negated for the production of universal history, but rather in situations crisscrossed by love and politics. Alliances and rivalries of both kinds track through the remains of her poems, the one often inseparable from the other. Mere jealousy, used by commentators to contain Sappho within discussions of sexual preferences and loss, gives way to the possibility that the poet's emotional investment in her companions and rivals is, in fact, strategic. Such strategy draws friend and foe alike into a synesthetic space that immerse her listeners in her blending of vision and touch. In poem 2, quote, breezes like honey blow, in the place to which Sappho invites her auditor, where, quote, from radiant shaking leaves, the sleep of enchantment descends. Sappho's word for sleep, coma, is also used by Pindar and Homer to indicate an overcoming of war and absent love, but Sappho's issues not from divine intervention, but from her own lyrical invention. Her sweet-toned breezes issuing from her lyre enkindle a space of a higher order than division into reciprocal self-validation. It is not relegated to the domain of terrifying fantasy by a mind so fearful of alterity that it posits it in order to eliminate it as a condition of its own possibility of being uniquely embodied and rationally endowed. In Sappho's world, the possibility of history does not rely on a trade-off between freedom and causality, or a calculus of debt and redemption. What is here is fleeting, and what passes will return, like lovers past and future. In the coma induced by the poem, infused with infinite promise and endless recurrence, the present is always already the unforeseeable future of the past. Finally, the poem is also bookended by the battlefield images of Aphrodite, called upon to swing down on Zeus's chariot and act as Sappho's fellow fighter, Sumachos. As much as it attends to the machinations of love, the poem is also therefore political. For this reason, someone like Kant would never have recognized Sappho as participating in the moral realm. By the same token, her world serves all the more as a reservoir of what might be possible as a politics unyoked from the metaphysical and aesthetic structures of the modern European concept of autonomy, a vastly broader repertoire that begins, for one, with the power of non-recognition. Non-recognition can be seen at work in fragment 31, which is in fact the poem that Longinus preserved as exemplary of the sublime and of the poet's skill at selecting and combining the most important and excessive terrifying concomitants for the display of love's madness. Though, according to Longinus, this is achieved at the cost of the contradictory psychophysical states that Sappho describes. Indeed, Longinus's interpretation hinges on a reconstruction of the first line of this poem that has generated countless attempts at painting Sappho either as a lover jealous of a man who has her beloved's attention, or as a schoolmistress gifting a song at the wedding of a former charge. Quote, "He seems to me godlike in his fortunes," which recognizes him as the rival from whom Sappho must both set herself apart and derive her emotional state. But philologists have also suggested that the mu in the word moi, myself, or me, he seems to me, is a corruption actually of a digamma, such that the line originally read, quote, "He must have seemed to himself equal to the gods." This version would indeed resonate with poem 1's many-mindedness. Mirrored in their self-regard, he nevertheless does not recognize that he is not equal to the gods, while she recognizes herself in the moment she loses speech, sight, and her bodily integrity. To borrow and also conclude from a speculative reading of the poem by Walter Benjamin, in her silence, she speaks the ending of what has been spoken, and in her blindness, she sees the completion of what can be seen. When she speaks, she therefore articulates the future as the uncontained and unsettled character of the past. In a many-minded and plurivocal world, non-recognition becomes strategy. The incorrigible shifts the ground beneath all claims to sovereignty and self-possession. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. And our final speaker today is Nora Fulton, who is a doctoral student at Concordia University in Montreal. Her research is interested in the ways that the thought of fundamental ontology and poetics in the philosophical tradition might intersect with discourses of transness and with trans theory. Her critical work has been published in Music and Literature, The Poetry Project, Radical Philosophy, and elsewhere. She is also the author of 3 collections of poetry, most recently The Display, From Documents, Antism Press. And the title of her paper today is Between Alladine and Ariadne, The Place of Woman in Badiouan Ontology. Please join me in welcoming Nora. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I just want to say how grateful I am to Erin and everyone who organized the symposium and also the conference from last year, would-be conference. I'm really happy to be here to work through all this with you and learn from all of you. As much as I'd love to contextualize a lot of what Badiou is doing, it could take forever. I'm a bit worried about time, so I'm just going to jump in to my paper. I arrived at the consultation for facial feminization surgery, a series of reconstructive procedures that aim to make a trans woman's face more recognizably female, both unable to afford it and unable to think it. Each operation was explained to me with the same mixture of gregariousness and effective distance that one might find at an orientation day for graduate students. The surgeon showed me where a bone needed to be shaved away, where a scalp needed to be refitted for maximum femininity, and why his approach was better than others. In this world, the idea of making a face indisputably more female is unproblematic, politically and philosophically. To engage with the philosophical as a trans woman is to always be asked to bracket such things, to notice an absence within an absence. Even in those rare moments where a thinker in this notoriously male-dominated tradition happens to remember that women exist, trans women are at best ignored and at worst deployed as argumentative foils to secure boundaries concerning the former. But likewise, to engage with one's transness as a philosopher is to risk thinking within the interiority of that absence, to risk being there in the kinds of encounter that it forces. In Elaine Badiou's Logics of Worlds, the second part of the philosophical trilogy that began with being an event, we encounter this distinction between being and appearing. Ontological identity does not entail any difference with itself, nor any degree of difference with regard to another. A pure multiple is entirely identified by its immanent composition, so that it's meaningless to say that it is more or less identical to itself. If it differs from another, it differs absolutely. But a being once worlded is and is not what it is, and since it differs from those beings which, in an identical manner, are of its world, it follows that differences in identities and appearing are a matter of more or less. The logic of appearing necessarily regulates degrees of difference, of a being with respect to itself and the same with respect to others. In being an event, the goal was ontological. There, Badiou claimed that being qua being is the immanence of the pure inconsistent multiple, which can only be presented through mathematics, more precisely through set theory. By identifying ontology with mathematics in this way, Badiou hoped to excise from it concepts of unity, identity, totality, and other trappings of a variously Kantian, Hegelian, and Heideggerian metaphysical inheritance. But what being an event did not fully address was the way that multiple being exists in a situation, a multiple which has been counted as one, in which such ideas, he admits, do indeed hold sway. This is the only consistency for which the non-mathematizable event could be a real and radical change. In Logics of Worlds, then, the goal was ontic. There he claimed that being as it appears is conditioned by a transcendental relation of difference and identity within the multiple, which can only be presented through logic and precisely through category theory. Badiou considers this an objective phenomenology. Appearing cannot be for any subject, but rather things only ever appear in the place of such appearing. A place he formerly called a situation and there calls a world, a non-total world among worlds. Yet Logics of Worlds repeatedly emphasizes that despite the reality of the pure inconsistent multiple, every atom of appearing, even if that atom appears only through an impure consistency attained by the count of identity, is real. How can this be? What interests me in the shift between being an event and Logics of Worlds is less the changes in Badiou's mathematical and logical armature, and more the way he uses the feminine and the figure of woman as explanatory analogies for what is central on both sides of that shift. For example, in being an event, the condition of possibility for evental rupture is attributed to the forcing of a generic indiscernibility within a situation or world. And this indiscernible supplement is symbolized through the icon of the female sex. It's reminiscent of some of the talks from yesterday, actually. In Logics of Worlds, the contrast between being qua being and being there as appearance is described through the feminine world presented by the Paul Dukas opera Ariadne and Bluebeard, wherein the rebellious Ariadne's feminine true being stands in opposition to that of Bluebeard's other 5 subservient wives. The figure of woman seems to be used to simultaneously connect as supplement and divide as rupture in Badiou's ontology. She is both what fails to appear as what she is and exemplary of appearing itself. So what does this mean for trans women, for whom this figuration is more than simply a metaphor? By investigating Badiou's figuration with transness in mind, I hope not only to unsettle his patrician ideas about sex and gender, but also to argue for their paradoxical utility to a trans theory that might reclaim the normative and the objective. The 1907 Dukas opera, through which Badiou reads this refiguration, is a musical rendition of a symbolist play by Maurice Maeterlinck, and Maeterlinck's play stands in a long line of interpretations of the Bluebeard folk story, which are usually grounded in Charles Perrault's 17th century anthologization. In Perrault's version, Bluebeard is a profligate aristocrat whose previous wives have disappeared, and his newest wife comes to discover that they've all been murdered, their bodies hidden in a secret room in the castle. The final wife's brothers manage to kill Bluebeard, rescue her, the end. In the Ducasse-Maeterlinck version, however, the sixth wife is named Ariadne after the labyrinth-savvy princess from Greek mythology. The other five wives are named after women characters from Maeterlinck's other writings, Melisande, Celisette, Igraine, Bellangère, and Alladine. In this version, the previous wives have not been murdered, but are instead imprisoned in the pitch darkness of a forbidden treasure room in the castle. Ariadne eventually frees them from the vault, overthrows Bluebeard with the help of a peasant uprising, but despite their newfound freedom, these five wives refuse to abandon the defeated Bluebeard, and only Ariadne leaves. The end. The detour through this opera takes place in the first section, the greater logic, where Badiou introduces his idea of the transcendental operator. Briefly, it designates the constitutive capacity of every world to assign to what abides there in that world variable intensities of identity, vis-a-vis what also abides there. In short, transcendental designates that a world in which pure multiplicities appear under the guise of objects is a network of identities and differences. Multiple being only appears as beings when a multiple is indexed to some transcendental, to a scale of degrees of difference to others and sameness to oneself, in which we can think the complex structures of disjunction, conjunction, and dependency between those degrees. These are concepts specific to category theory, how he uses them there. Through the spontaneous generation of this logical order among the elements of a multiple, a kind of ontological rank becomes manifest, such that every transcendental makes visible three things. One, a minimum, that which is not in a world and appears as inexistent. A maximum, that which is absolutely in a world and appears as existent. And an envelope, that which is a local stable region of the world, or what appears as appearing. In Badiou's reading, Ariadne and Bluebeard is essentially about the visibility of deliverance, about the fact that it is not enough for freedom to be, in this case under the name and the acts of Ariadne, but that freedom must also appear. This is no unsexed freedom, however. In Badiou's reading, the darkness of the vault in which Bluebeard's wives are trapped stands in for appearance in general. It's from this vault that we hear the collective phenomenal song of these women. That's a term for diegetic singing within opera, before they're seen on stage. In truth, becoming a woman in Bluebeard's world means ending up in the vault of identity. If Ariadne's opening of this vault strives for an ascent towards the light, something like a manifestation of the becoming manifest of being, a vibrant localization of being free in the palace of servitude, then she cannot make the other women see this new freedom. In contrast to the manifestation of one's mere being, there is no infinite ascension towards the light of being there. One either appears as free, as a woman, or one does not. Ariadne fails to intervene in this world because she does not make the dominant term, its transcendental, apparent. But what is this term? It can't be the literal figure of domination, Bluebeard, man, how it's variously read, since the conjunction of Ariadne with him is incomparable to his conjunction with each of the other wives. These two subsets occupy and reveal different envelopes of the world, different envelopes of domination. Badiou instead says this dominant term is femininity as such, the unstable dialectical admixture of servitude and freedom. Ariadne's presence as a real woman, the only real woman here, her true being, shorn of appearance, interrupts this series of feminine fates, but it can't change it. And her song at the end of the opera, the climax of the opera, in which she's begging the other women to leave the castle, is cast by Badiou as a femininity song in opposition to the phenomenal song, as if in this one you can hear the sound of the transcendental organization of this world and of these women. Unlike the diegetic song of Bluebeard's Wives, Ariadne's Threnody becomes non-diegetic and testifies that woman can never appear in a world made to make women appear. As Badiou points out in the staging of the opera, Ariadne is made so hyper-visible during the femininity song. It's a notoriously long and difficult part to sing, but the song detaches itself from her. The song continues as she stops singing on stage. Between those who subjectively have nothing in common with Ariadne, who make up her exterior, her absolutely heterogeneous feminine ground, and the new feminine world that appears through Ariadne's imperatives of disobedience and flight, all of these elements remain enveloped by the feminine, which here is merely the captive repetition of their identity, the identity of being there. The scattered material for a global supremacy, which is at last declared. Badiou's unearthing of a retrograde feminism in this play isn't quite original, but the crucial point is that in Badiou's system, since Ariadne is the maximum of this world, she has a reverse that's the minimum of the world. So who or what is this minimum, the inexistent, the nil degree of woman whose invisibility is made visible? According to Badiou, it's Alladine. Alladine is only one of the five wives, is the only one of the five wives who does not speak. Hers is a mime role. But what then is the reverse of Alladine? It's not, as one might think, Ariadne again, because in category theory, logical reversal doesn't function like negation does in classical logic, it doesn't have to, as a transitive relation. The reverse is what is maximally alien to what is given, the synthesis of what is entirely exterior to it. The reverse of Alladine, since she is the lower bound of woman, is not the upper bound in Ariadne. Badiou shows that Alladine's reverse is in fact the femininity song itself, the appearing of woman itself, the boundary of the world in which she is invisible. This is why for Badiou, conflict within appearance has nothing to do with an immanent dialectic between being and being there, or between essence and existence. Ariadne, the real woman, and Alladine, the false woman, are not opposed in themselves. They're opposed by and to a world, a situation. This is also why he considered the moment in which Ariadne embraces Alladine at the closure of the opera, both of them helpless to be anything other than what they are, so moving. The conjunction of Ariadne and her reverse, Alladine, is reduced to mere tears, the nothingness of all affirmation. Alladine can't speak, and thus she can't even answer Ariadne when she asks her, "Do you want to be free?" In this irreducibly feminine world, such a question implicitly also means, do you want to be a woman, and do you want to exist simultaneously? It's no coincidence that when Ariadne tries to sell Alladine on the promise of what lies outside the castle, it's described as the blue countryside and the vaults of azure, the same inescapable shade that also tinges the beard of the Lord of Orlamond. Badiou certainly has the ideas of his teacher Lacan in mind in this figuration of woman, but they also lead him into some confusion as Logics of Worlds progresses. For example, Badiou also reads a painting by Hubert Robert alongside the Ducasse opera, whereas Badiou concluded that in Ariadne and Bluebeard, woman semi-exists, which is a minor disagreement with Lacan, as he points out, because of the dialectical gap between the two women described above. In Robert's The Bathing Pool, wherein a group of women in various stages of undress bathe among the statues in the waters, one of these statues representing a man draped in scant cloth, a loincloth obscuring his genitals, Badiou concludes that without a doubt, the masculine sex exists for this painting. This time, the minimum of a feminine world is not the most invisible woman, the least woman, as Alladine had been taken to be, but is instead the veiled organ of that lone statue, which Badiou claims is not displaying the masculine sex differently from how all the other non-masculine elements of the painting are failing to display it. No real reason is given for Badiou's decision that this is a world girded by inexistent maleness, while that was a world girded by semi-existent femaleness. And yet somehow in every world, and to break the conceit in every encounter with transness, such a decision inevitably gets made. Why is the decision so much simpler with the painting than with the opera? Doesn't Alladine's total subordination to the laws of appearance set down by male supremacy make her an extension of the masculine rather than the feminine world? What if the single male statue in the Robert painting is not of a cis man, but of a trans man? With the same stone loincloth in place around his waist and nothing but more stone and paint really behind it, does anything change in Badiou's decision? Why does the organ veiled by the stone function as the dominant term, while those organs veiled by water do not? How do we know that Alladine didn't have a dick? She was silent throughout the play, and they say that the voice is a dead giveaway. My intention here isn't to chastise Badiou for a kind of unconscious transphobia, even if he is a man who has quipped about transsexualism as being akin to homeopathy, which I should say is quite the barb coming from someone who believes that being itself is a stitching together of the void. And that quip is from the book on St. Paul and Universalism. Rather, I want to suggest that if Catherine Malibu is right when she says that every ontological project produces an economy of visibility, then the way Badiouan ontology yields a phenomenology strangely evades some of the traps that trans theory repeatedly finds itself caught in by digging even more deeply into them. If one decides to position the reality of sex and gender purely within appearance, for example, one ends up with a tautological performativity. If one decides to position this reality purely within being in itself, one ends up with a tautological insistence. Badiou instead decides that the coming to being of woman as a subject to truth occurs within being qua being and within being there as appearance, in a kind of vertical symmetry, and that any radical change would have to also occur symmetrically. The kind of decision that Badiou makes between the opera and the painting is the same one made between Ariadne and Alladine, and between cis and trans articulations of womanhood. This decision requires that, and this is a quote, a longer quote, requires that an actual dimension of the multiple, of ontological composition, be involved in the identification of every unit of appearing. There where the one is, there where the one appears, the one is. This explains why appearing, there where it is one, can't be other than it is. For the postulate of materialism, that every atom is real, requires that the it's one be sustained by some one that is. And this is, he builds up this pun in French that I'll try and get across here. It will not be in vain to refer to it as the unease, l'inquiète, to the extent that it is indeed there where logic draws its consistency from the ontological, there that thought can enter into its most fecund unease. And this is this play between inquietude and l'inquiétude, the one who studies the one also. Far from being an event's tendency to treat that which is counted as one as something epiphenomenal, contingent, and inessential, the arbitrariness of who counts as a woman and who is counted as a woman. In Logics of Worlds, Badiou affirms that it's only by taking seriously the forced and real consistency of phenomenal appearing that the conditions for radical change can truly arise at the level of the being of what appears, at the level of being qua being. What passes between Alladine and Ariadne in their farewell embrace is an uneasiness with this fact, that traversing the contingency of the female sex as it exists, as the transcendental of inclusion and exclusion that it undeniably is, can at the same time make one fecund with the necessity of its multiplicity. Ariadne and Alladine's traversals point in different directions. One leads out of the castle, one leads into its bowels, but in each case they head into the same blue, the same azure, which is a matter between the two of them and them alone. it seems to me that there's no better way to begin articulating the properly ontological dimensions of transness than to say that it's a kind of decision for the possibility of radical change, and it cleaves to the same kind of study, thought that has entered fecund unease. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Nora, for that wonderful paper. So I've enjoyed all of them. My head is spinning, not with wine. I haven't started. I'm still on the tea, but with ideas. And I'm sure all your minds are also buzzing with questions. So I think we're going to take questions from our panelists first, and then I'll take questions from the Q&A, reading those out from attendees. So I have a question from Karen for Elissa to kick us off. Karen, if you want to unmute.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you for all of the really, really wonderful talks. I thought of it in relation to Elissa's talk, which was very provocative, but they were so closely interwoven that I feel that really maybe perhaps others could chime in as well. Perhaps it pertains to Nora's talk and to Julia's as well. The first was a comment on how it seemed that the many ways that you had described the characterization of Antigone in Hegel, in Heidegger and Lacan as a phallic virgin and badass butch spoke in many ways to the kind of ways that castration anxiety is kind of appears nowadays, sort of in pop culture, right? And the kind of ways that pop culture gives us the figures a kind of feminine empowerment as this sort of desexualized kind of like phallic fantasy of kind of non-castration. But I also was thinking about, the way that you talked about Lacan referencing Antigone, I guess in the ethics seminar, and then again, I thought of it, right, she appears again, but not in relation to the play Antigone, but rather in Oedipus at Colonus in the 17th seminar, right? Where she becomes a support for castration. So you think of like a kind of parallelism between Oedipus is castration. There she appears as a daughter, right? Not as a sister to a brother, or not sister to as a daughter, right? And so you have kind of Oedipus is castration in parallel to this other figuration of Antigone as the uncastrated, or as this kind of sublime objection. And so at first I thought, so I guess what occurred to me from that point on was, positing, so there are these ways in which, this led me to think of like this, there are ways in which, when Lacan kind of around those years of like 67, 68, right? When Antigone returns, but in a different play, you get these formulations of another formulation of the ethics, right? Like another formulation of ethics around this kind of feminine ethics of the symbolic, right? And, Antigone as a character forms part of that. But that formulation is always in relation to the symbolic, in the sense that like what comes afterwards is kind of pushing further into what would this ethics, or what would this relation of a commonality be in the absence or in the radical questioning, right? The experience of a radical questioning of, of the absolute contingency of the symbolic. What would that look like? So in other words, in the absence of some kind of quasi-transcendental principle. And I wondered how you thought about that. I mean, because your talk was it was evocative for me in many different ways, not only in relation to pop culture, in relation to different kinds of works of modernist literature in Latin America. But I wanted to, I guess it was more of a comment to see if this reacted, sort of how this, your take on the sort of problematic portrayal of Antigone maybe speaks to a problem of kind of positing some sort of feminine politics, to go back to maybe some of the talks from yesterday.
Thanks so much for that. Well, first of all, just a comment, which I noticed, for example, if you read Antigone's Claim, Butler's book, she has to put Oedipus at Colonus together with Antigone. So there's a slide, because the figure of Antigone is readable in Oedipus at Colonus, and it's an acceptable figure, and she's not a badass butch and a scary dude, and she's very human. And I think there are 30 years, right? Antigone takes place first. How does it work? But was written last. I'm going to get my chronology wrong, and is that right? Or have I reversed it? Somebody tell me, because my point is that I actually think the three plays can't be read in relation to one another. And I think that one domesticates or humanizes the problem when one does. So, and the people on the members of the Women in Theory Collective know that in the first iteration of this, I was going to talk about Greta Thunberg. And that Greta Thunberg was like sort of the animating figure of the whole thing. And at that time, I didn't know, although I haven't read it, that like Bernard Stiegler has an entire volume on Greta Thunberg and philosophy, and Greta Thunberg as Antigone. And so, and part of why I'm saying this is that in pop culture, just to answer that part of things, I really thought that, like, I wasn't the first person. Everybody was making the association of Greta Thunberg and Antigone, as if this were not problematic somewhere, as if there was a fantasy that, that this teenage girl, and she was teenaged, who is actually on the autism spectrum, as she herself puts it, who started when she was 15, that she would be in the position of having that Antigone's truth to power, and that as the kind of organizing figure for a politics, that there was an investment in her power, let's put it that way, as one girl. And I'm all for, like, one of the reasons I took Greta Thunberg out of the paper was that I don't want to be beating up on Greta Thunberg. Like, I think that what she's done is amazing. So I'm not like against her politics, but I was against the fantasy of sovereign power that is invested in pop culture in her, rather than in her efforts in itself. And that fantasy of sovereign power has to do with a virginal, teenage, desexualized, I mean, there's all of the sense that, I mean, I don't know, maybe Greta Thunberg now has a partner, but that her lack of sexuality is sort of part of that power. And there was something else I was going to say. Whereas in Oedipus and Colonus, there's so much, well, and both sisters have it. Anyway, that's a different role, and that is sort of very far from what I was doing. So I would separate the two. Politics. This paper is haunted by Bonnie Honig's book on Antigone. And okay, this is being recorded, so I'm going to try to be tactful and not say exactly what I think. But Bonnie Honig has a one-liner that basically organizes what she wants to do with Antigone in politics. And she, like, her goal is to reclaim Antigone for politics. And she wants to push back against what she calls a politics of lamentation that becomes the lamentation of politics. So she sort of wants to say that all of the prior readers who want to make Antigone's grief or her affect or, you know, part, that any attempt at that always ends up neutralizing politics. So she actually explicitly wants to go for a kind of a phallic, well, no, see, that's where I'm calling out Bonnie Honig, is that she wants to say that there is a sisterly thing. So her reading uncovers an actual conspiratorial sister-sister relationship that she invents in order to lay claim for this sovereign political force. And I think it's totally wishful, and it's a total phallic fantasy. And so I think that Bonnie Honig's claim for Antigone is a disavowal of the past, it's a disavowal of vulnerability, it's a disavowal of castration. And if that's the, you know, I mean, there's a lot of things, and she's sort of doing it provocatively to say there is a power in Antigone that we need to own. And I think it's in bad faith, is what, around the question of gender, sexuality, etc. I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much, Elissa. I'm going to jump now to reading out some questions from the Q&A for some of our other speakers, and then we'll flip back to panelists and take another round if we can. But first up, a question for Julia from Simon Leung. Between the intentional erasure and misreading of the feminine figure, Asian women, Sapphic figures, what are your thoughts of making oneself unreadable as a strategy or survival tactic, as in a figure caught in impossible fields? That one's for you, Julia.
Yeah, thank you very thank you very much for that question. So I have a couple of thoughts about this. I'm wondering whether, in fact, this strategy of making oneself unreadable in respect specifically to the Asian and Asian diasporic context has not been the strategy all along, but that has not been a strategy that is sort of originated from anything that's in the interest of the Asian communities, but one that has been invented and imposed by white supremacy. I think really the moment, my concern really is that for too long, really, what could be understood as making oneself unreadable as a strategy, namely as passing as white adjacent, has meant that the Asian diaspora has allowed itself to be used for the purposes of white supremacy to divide and conquer Black from brown from yellow, etc. So just to put, in a name to it, hiding behind the moniker of model minority is something that I would associate with sort of a strategy of making myself unreadable. And hiding behind this idea of a model minority has precisely rendered illegible the type of anti-Asian violence that we're seeing on the street today as racism, either because all Asians are assumed to be the same kind of people as people who look like me, so like East Asians who are sort of high achieving, therefore do not need help, do not need affirmative action, which obviously serves white supremacy's purposes of keeping, say, elite institutions white, rather than, say, having to invest in more institutions so that everybody who does merit an education gets one. And secondly, it also, obscures differences within the Asian community. So for instance, especially as those differences hew to class differences, those differences then don't register at all or don't or are dismissed. So for instance, Burmese and Filipino populations, right? 30% of them live in poverty. We don't get that with this idea of Asian and or Asian, as in terms of like using a sort of like illegibility as a kind of strategy. Also, what gets rendered illegible, just talking about the current circumstances, is like, the women who work in these spas and massage parlors for a multitude of reasons, right, that are infinitely more complex than, say, either some kind of sacrificial moral narrative or some hypersexualized moral narrative that apparently has been sort of like supported and sort of perpetuated by the Christian right in America. Those also don't get recognized, but also are part of this complex of, I think, what has been for too long being the strategy of the Asian and Asian diaspora communities, which is to render ourselves as illegible as possible. And I think one of the more hopeful things that I'm seeing right now, and one of the things I'm trying to argue, I think, with my hopefully sort of ability to reframe my piece on Sappho along these lines more explicitly, is that not like non-recognition rather than rendering oneself illegible would mean that finally we do speak up, or one does speak up, instead of sort of like thinking that a strategy for survival is to hew to sort of like essentially what the ruling class wants. What is this non-recognition supposed to look like? Well, first of all, non-recognition as a way to sort of not recognize what masquerades as neutrality, right? What has been constructed as neutrality. And secondly, non-recognition as a recognition of the loss of self as a strategy, and as also recognizing non-recognition as itself a complex of racism and sexism whose self-effacement itself has been constructed and instrumentalized. specifically for in the Asian context, in order to sort of like divide one racialized and oppressed group from another. And there's a lot more I could say about this, but yeah, there's one person who's been writing about this a lot is Mary Matsuda, a law professor from Hawaii. She's one of the first people who were part of the formation of critical race theory, and she has an address to the Asian Law Caucus from some decades ago that addresses precisely this issue of why Asians need to sort of refuse to be used by virtue of their self-effacement and rendering of oneself as illegible. There's another piece of writing that where she also argues for a version of what I'm hoping to sort of use Sappho to sort of articulate more clearly, which is multiple consciousness as a strategy within jurisprudence, where rather than reducing voices within jurisprudence to sort of groups competing against one another for non-erasure, you would have actually, something that adds up to a kind of what she calls a new jurisprudence that's founded not on the ideal of neutrality, but on the reality of oppression. And that, I want to think further with that idea rather than illegibility again as the strategy that a lot of, admittedly, a lot of Asian groups still continue to perpetuate in their discourses about themselves and their place in dominant society.
Thanks very much, Julia. With an eye on the clock, we might be able to go a couple of minutes over, but I'm going to read out both of our questions for Nora. And Nora, maybe you can take them either together if you want to link them, or with more emphasis on one or the other as you kind of please. So the first question is from Sam Samore, who asks if you could speak to how a Badiouan trans theory might speak to the popular notion of gender as fluid. Based on your paper, especially with the concept of decision, it seems to me that in some way they are opposed, which I don't think is a bad thing, but would be curious to hear your thoughts. And then a question from Jacques Lazra, who also thanks everyone for their stunning presentations. And he has a request for a bit more. Can you say more about what you called vertical symmetry? Does it install or line up with? And isn't it, if so, subject to critiques of a sort of correlationist principle here between ontological claims and the claims that are proper to the appearing of beings and beings? So quite a technical question there. So I don't know if you want to take them either entangled or separated as you like.
I should, yeah. So I have 5 minutes to deal with these, which is a lot. So I'll just kind of talk about each of them briefly, and I'll start with Sam Samore's question. And I guess two things on that. One is, I don't know how popular that notion really is. And I think that in Badiou and thinkers surrounding him, it is assumed to be a popular notion, and it's assumed to be a problem, actually, that they're dealing with. And this is why that they assume the notion of gender as fluid is some sort of problem. Joan Kopchak has talked about this, Alenka Zupančič has talked about this, Badiou talks about it in this book. And it's one of the reasons he's sometimes seen as, and is in some ways, sexually conservative and trying to preserve notions of sexual difference, bisexed, like a bisexed conception of love. It's this whole discussion. But I don't really think it's as popular as these thinkers really assume it is, especially if you look globally. I think if you look at an American context and a European context in which these are kind of scare topics of the day, that's all they are, really. I don't know how true it is that they're popular notions. But I will say that that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in Badiou. And again, I only have a couple minutes, but he's kind of contrasting his work with the popular, that this idea he sees it coming out of. And what he's trying to do is preserve a room for truth. And I think this kind of flows into the discussion about decision. I mean, in his work and in the way I'm reading it and finding it useful, decision is not like choice. It's like following through with a procedure of like transformation of a world. And that's a whole other discussion. I think that's one distinction to make. So I don't know if it even really does oppose notions of fluidity or even non-binariness, which is another huge discussion about just how equipped his work is to talk to that. And I guess this also has to do with the second question, because I'm just trying to kind of identify the ways in which his work might be doing things that he's not aware of. So yeah, he is kind of participating in this critique of and I don't want to get into the technical debate around these terms, which are for me, a bit dated at this point, but he is critiquing a position in which phenomenological events have some sort of connection to the ontological. But at the same time, Logics of Worlds and his phenomenology is trying to solve a problem in being an event, which is that there's nothing in being an event that explains how the event takes place. So he's trying to show that there is some sort of, he calls them points in this book, in which like areas in which the transcendental, the term of domination, can be revealed through fidelity to them. So I don't know that answers the question, but I guess I would just say that I do think that this is happening in his work. There's lots of people that might disagree with me, but yeah, I think that it's a way to read the work. I wish I could say more, but I guess it's two now.
Thank you very much, Nora. I'm going to take a question from the Q&A for Valeria. And then we'll see with time, we might have time for one final quick question after that. So the question for you, Valeria, hopefully you can now see that, and hopefully our attendees can also see all the questions, even the ones we might not be able to get to. So for you, Valeria, the concept and territory of inebriation. Thinking of the connections between wine and entheogens, psychedelics, in the ancient world, and particularly in the women-centered mysteries of Eleusis, I would like to know if inebriation, particularly as truth-building philosophical state, describes only the temporal space where the body experiences the effect, or if this territory expands before or after those moments. And the question from Ivan Aguirre goes on, I'm also thinking this question particularly around your quote, roughly, poetry unbuilds itself and every other discourse, which pushes me to think of which, if any, ethical imperatives in the shaping of consumption of substances can center this unbuilding in the building of truth, and which foreclose the unbuilding and history of alcohol violence. So there's a lot in there, but if you would like to take some of it more or less inebriated in your response, then that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Well, really, I have, I don't think these are really questions. I take them as comments on what I have just exposed. Psychedelics. Well, I think what I have said, I'm going to say something very general, no, due to the time as well. I just think that everything I work on related to wine or to drugs or to food is my main field of work. The aim of those works really is to show that philosophical text or any epistemological, really, any epistemological discourse that claims to have, I don't know, some kind of normativity for truth, and if you can find in those discourse, you know, a relation with food that is usually metaphoric, you know, we could say it's usually a metaphoric relation to food, because food is not really a theme or a topic for philosophy in its history. So what I have found is that this tropic reference to truth, including wine, what they allow me is to try to think about logic, the logic of philosophy in a new way. Try to think specifically the structure of, you could say, speculative relations, subject-object, or
this correlation that is in the center of Western philosophy, in a way that is ruinous, as I said, for philosophy itself, since the relation with the other would have the form of incorporation of something alien, of something foreign to the corpus of philosophy. So this is what I mainly try to do. I think this applies to food as well, even though food seems to be, how you said, nothing really dangerous for the body. Actually, the body needs food, right? But I think that food actually can also be considered in this way, since digestions are not always successful. No, we need to start thinking how also our paradigm of intaking food is metaphysically determined, if you can say so. No, so it's determined by another paradigm of assimilation, of complete assimilation or reduction of what is other. So I like to think all of these figures that you find in philosophy related to wine, to drugs, to food, as a case of parasitism in general. This means a case of eating with other and with the other inside, that also eats the body that intakes this other. That is what I could say in general. I'm not sure if I understand the full sense of Ivan's question, but I don't know if this can say something about that. And well, in this same level of argumentation, I wanted to ask Elissa, but maybe we can talk about this in another occasion, because she was quoting, Elissa, you were quoting, right, this Derrida phrase that says that Antigone is in Hegel the vomit of the system. But
I think that we'll probably return to the remaining questions later, because there are more questions in the Q&A too, and Rosada has her hand up too.
Yes, I'm afraid we're going to have to cut that off there with a number of unanswered questions, as I'm sure hopefully we can pick them up in the final session today and have a more wide-ranging discussion at that point. So in recognition of the fact we've run over a little bit, we'll reconvene at 20 past. And yes, obviously, sorry that we don't have more time, but we hopefully can pick these things up afterwards. So we'll reconvene in just under 15 minutes at 20 past, whatever hour you are at.
Yo puedo ser tu gran amiga, incluso tu compañera de vida. Yo puedo ser tu gran aliada, la que aconseja y la que apaña. Yo puedo ser cualquiera de todas, depende de cómo tú me apodas. Pero no voy a ser la que obedece, porque mi cuerpo me pertenece. Yo decido de mi tiempo, cómo quiero y dónde quiero. Independiente yo nací, independiente decidí. Yo no camino detrás de ti, yo camino de la para ti. Tú no me vas a humillar, tú no me vas a gritar. Tú no me vas a someter, tú no me vas a golpear, tú no me vas a denigrar, tú no me vas a obligar, tú no me vas a silenciar, tú no me vas a callar. No sumisa ni obediente, mujer fuerte, insurgente, independiente y valiente, romper la cadena de lo indiferente, no pasiva ni oprimida, mujer linda que das vida, emancipada en autonomía, antipatriarca y alegría. protagonista de nuestra historia y la que agita a la gente, la comunidad, la que despierta la vecindad, la que organiza la economía de su casa, de su familia. Mujer libre se pone de pie y a romper las cadenas de la piel. Tú no me vas a humillar, tú no me vas a gritar, tú no me vas a someter, tú no me vas a golpear, tú no me vas a denigrar, tú no me vas a obligar, tú no me vas a silenciar, tú no me vas a callar. No sumisa ni obediente, mujer fuerte, insurgente, independiente y valiente, romper la cadena de lo indiferente, no pasiva ni oprimida, mujer linda que das vida, emancipada en autonomía, antipatriarca y alegría. A liberar, a liberar, a liberar. Libera, libera, libera. Libera, libera, Yo busco libertad con nombre y apellido, como una caída. modo sencillo. Con las pocas horas que tengo contigo, debo yo pelear con peces que quieren ser amigos, que hablan al oído a través de comerciales y que seducen mediante sus canales. Pero ya ves, estamos tú y yo construyendo un mundo para los dos, por ti, por mí y todos los compañeros que ya no le compran a este sucio juego. Caminar por esa senda y resistir para que tú conquistes ese buen vivir. Donde lo tengan todo, no te tienen a ti. Que los peces gordos no pueden volar. Hijo, yo sé, nada tiene sentido. Incluso lo que yo diga no suene divertido. No te digo que el mundo está acabado, pero los peces gordos están en todos lados. No estoy en contra de que juguemos, solo contarte cómo es el juego. Quizás no es un parque y el mall no es una plaza, y ese celular a los amigos no reemplaza. Requiero para ti cosas sencillas, que dibujes un mundo de justicia y alegría. Y yo sé que afuera todo brilla, pero si tú lo miras, verás la mentira. Caminar por esa senda y resistir para que tú conquistes ese buen vivir. Donde lo tengan todo, no te tienen a ti. Oye, hijo, por ti, por mí y todos los compañeros que ya no le compran a este sucio juego. Hijo, yo sé, nada tiene sentido. Incluso lo que yo diga no suena divertido. Pero Kitsaño no es un parque y el mall no es una plaza. Oye, y ese celular a los amigos no reemplaza. Cuando grande quiero ser un niño y reírme contigo de un modo sencillo. Y acuérdate, fiel a tus valores, tú debes ir. Caminar por esa senda y resistir para que tú conquistes ese buen vivir. Porque los peces gordos son dueños del mundo, pero no son dueños de ti. Creo en lo imposible, que la locura más cuerda es buscar cómo ser libre. Creo en lo imposible, que de nuestras espaldas brotarán las alas que nos harán volar invencible. Creo en lo imposible, que el símbolo silenciará el efecto de sus misiles. Creo en lo imposible, creo que es posible hacer de este mundo un mundo sensible. Creo en nuestros sueños como punta de lanza, el arma perfecta para nivelar la balanza. Creo en las acciones cotidianas que te llenan de vida, te llenan de esperanza.
En lo pequeño radica la fuerza, con tu cariño yo caminaré, imaginando rutinas bellas para dar vuelta al mundo al revés. Empezar por nuestra casa primero, romper con todo nuestro miedo, ser consecuente de cuerpo y de mente para alzar el vuelo por senderos nuevos.
Porque tu luz cotidiana enciende la sonrisa que sale por la mañana.
Creo en ti porque veo tu fuerza inexplicable, esa justa dignidad inconmensurable.
Creo en ti, yo reafirmo que tu rabia proviene del dolor y tu lucha florece del amor.
Porque en ti me veo yo.
Creo en ti, con problemas y dilemas, con trabas, con vallas, con tropiezos y con penas. Creo en el cotidiano que hemos hecho a mano, tallado con el...
Welcome back, everyone. We'll begin in just a minute. Okay, welcome to our final session of papers. We will dedicate the last hour of our meeting to general discussion and debate. So those of you whose questions were not yet answered, especially those of you who had questions or comments linking the ideas, problems, concepts of the different presentations, you are welcome to bring those to our final discussion. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of our final panel, Rosaura Martinez Ruiz, full professor of philosophy at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, and a member of the National System of Researchers Level 3. She is the author of Freud y Derrida, Escritura y Psique, and Eros, Más allá de la pulsión de muerte. The English translation of Eros will be published, I believe, very soon by Fordham University Press with a foreword by Judith Butler. In 2017, Rosaura was awarded the Research Prize in Humanities by the Mexican Academy of Sciences, and in 2019, she was a Fulbright Scholar. She is part of the advisory board of the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs coordinated by Judith Butler. So thank you, Rosaura, for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Erin, and especially for inviting me to chair this panel with women that I deeply admire, and some of you I actually have the pleasure to have met, and I do love you. I want to say that I have been working with women for the last 10 years, and I do feel the power and especially the politics of care among us, and I really appreciate and I feel that here. So I'm very grateful to Erin for inviting me this time to chair this table. So I'm gonna introduce first our hostess, Erin Graff, who is talking next. Erin Graff is professor of Spanish and Portuguese and comparative literature at the University of Southern California. And during the 2020-21 academic year, she was distinguished visiting professor of literature at UCSD. She's the author of 3 books on archaeologists reading as misreading, Figurative Inquisitions, Conversation, Torture, and Truth in the Luso-Hispanic Atlantic, and The Wandering Signifier, Rhetoric of Jewishness in the Latin American Imaginary, as well as the editor of 5 books and dossiers on deconstruction, ethics, and politics. She's currently serving a 4-year term on the Modern Language Association's Executive Council, and today she's gonna share with us her paper on with the title Irritating Subjects, Beauvoir and Levinas. Erin, please.
Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope by now. For a long time, I have hesitated to write a book on woman. The subject is irritating, especially to women, and it is not new. These lines, as you may recall, open Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. Yet they could also just as easily be my own words. For a long time, I have hesitated to write on women. Then a few years ago, as I was revising a book manuscript I'd recently completed, I was mortified to realize that my entire bibliography, or a significant portion of it, was male. Has that ever happened to you? At the same time, a then candidate for president was caught on tape bragging about grabbing women. And, well, the rest is history. I escaped to Argentina during my sabbatical, where a new wave of feminism was exploding, driven at first by the high rate of femicides in that country, 1 woman every 18 hours, but soon linked to other social and political problems, financial debt, police violence, and abortion rights, which finally achieved legislative victory several months ago, following decades of struggle. During this period, I continued to read works of ethical and political philosophy and deconstruction, Levinas, Derrida, and others, now alongside and in tension with recent experimental and independent films by Argentinian women. Albertina Carri, the daughter of disappeared militant parents during the civil-military dictatorship, Narcissa Hirsch, an experimental filmmaker who at age 93 continues to produce avant-garde short films, Lucrecia Martel, whom you all know. I returned to some of the thinkers who introduced me to theory, Beauvoir, Judith Butler, and Barbara Christian, who directed my undergraduate honors thesis on Toni Morrison. I began to conceptualize this sort of reading rather differently than I had before. I began to understand reading as a sort of exposure in a number of senses. Levinas's reading in Derrida's would be exposed to Carri, Hirsch, and Martel, and vice versa. When the works I exposed one another, each brought the other out of itself. And when they thereby mutually posed themselves outside the spots cultures of reading had assigned them to, they exposed each and the other concepts, devices, approaches, elisions, photograms imperceptible without the exposure. They brought each other into danger. I began to theorize relation as exposure, and suddenly I found myself in Paris at a Simone de Beauvoir conference, presenting a version of this talk. What brought me there was a footnote. In her introduction to the second sex, Beauvoir takes issue with the representation of the feminine in the work of Levinas. Published just 2 years after Levinas's 1947 works, Existence and Existence and Time and the Other, the second sex refers critically to Levinas's equation of femininity with otherness, and with his masculinization of the universal subject. Since then, feminist and Levinasian scholars have alternately attacked and defended Levinas, arguing in favor of a feminist conception of ethical subjectivity and ethical responsibility. Rather than frame the encounter as one could easily, as a squabble in post-war French Hegelianism, what would happen if we were to read Beauvoir's work critically from and through the thought of Levinas? Can the mutual critique of and exposure between these ethically and politically powerful thinkers yield productive readings, readings that would expand the possibility of responsibility, moving beyond the dichotomy between self and other, subjectivity and alterity? Exposure of this sort might help open a path out of the constraining Hegelian scene where self and other, self-identity and negation, the absolute and contradiction, master and slave endlessly face off and endlessly limit how we think about the juncture between ethics and politics. Reading both Beauvoir and Levinas against the grain and reading them with and against one another, each exposed to the thought of the other, I want to suggest, we can begin to imagine a feminist ethics and ethical feminism that pushes beyond identity and difference. For those of you who do not recall the footnote, and I admit that I did not, it follows in the introduction to the second sex, Beauvoir's central claim that men are understood to be universal, but that women are merely defined in relation to and distinct from men. And this is Beauvoir. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. The footnote, and this is a long one. So it's Beauvoir referring to Levinas. Beauvoir. Levinas expresses this idea most explicitly in his essay, My French is horrible when I'm nervous. It's not great when I'm not nervous. And now quoting Levinas, is there not a case in which otherness, alterity, unquestionably marks the nature of a being as its essence, an instance of otherness not consisting purely and simply in the opposition of two species of the same genus? I think that the feminine represents the contrary in its absolute sense, this contrariness being in no wise affected by any relation between it and its correlative, and thus remaining absolutely other. Sex is not a certain specific difference, no more is a sexual difference a mere contradiction, nor does this difference lie in the duality of two complementary terms, for two complementary terms imply a pre-existing whole. Otherness reaches its full flowering in the feminine, a term of the same rank as consciousness, but of opposite meaning. End of Levinas's quote. Beauvoir continues in the footnote. I suppose that Levinas does not forget that woman too is aware of her own consciousness or ego, but it is striking that he deliberately takes a man's point of view, disregarding the reciprocity of subject and object. When he writes that woman is mystery, he implies that she is mystery for man. Thus, his description, which is intended to be objective, is in fact an assertion of masculine privilege. End of quote. In recent decades, feminist and Levinasian scholars have sparred over whether the case can be made that Levinas's ethical philosophy is grounded in a patriarchal worldview, or whether he has been misunderstood by Beauvoir, whether he did not merely use such notions as femininity and maternity as metaphors that have no predetermined link to historical material bodies who identify or identified as women. R.J.S. Manning claims that, quote, Levinas is not opposing an exclusively feminine object to an exclusively masculine subject, insisting that, quote, on the contrary, Levinas's philosophy challenges all such violent appropriations of the other and is therefore an ally in the ethical struggle against the oppression of women, which is feminism, end of quote. Sonia Sika, on the other hand, maintains that even if the maternal body is a metaphor, metaphors matter. Claire-Elise Katz, for her part, refers to Richard Cohen's defense of Levinas when, in the translator's introduction to Time and the Other, He argues that, quote, Beauvoir has misunderstood Levinas's analysis and simplified the relationship between the subject, he, who is absolute, and the feminine other, end of quote. Katz sustains that, quote, Cohen's defense of Levinas reminds us that for Levinas, the other has priority over the subject, and thus Beauvoir was too quick to chastise Levinas for sexism, concluding that, quote, Beauvoir is right to ask after the way in which the feminine is conceived by him. However, by attacking him for casting woman as other, she reveals her misunderstanding of what Levinas means by the other and the position the other holds in his analysis. As a result, she also does not see the way Levinas's project radically departs from the philosophies that precede him, end of quote. And I think this is my final quote, but just to give you an idea of the debate, Diane Perpich finally acknowledges that, quote, the feminine is nowhere identified by Levinas with concrete, really existing beings. It is not a set of characteristics or qualities attributed to a certain class of beings, namely women. It is not a type of which individual women would be tokens. Rather, the feminine is a principle of equivocation, introducing into being not only an essential duality or plurality, but a proliferating structure of ambiguity, end of quote. I'll take a drink after all that. Not wine, alas. Now, I'm not particularly interested in defending Levinas against Beauvoir or defending Beauvoir against Levinas. I want to take a slightly different road into this debate by reframing the terms at hand. Rather than asking whether Levinas privileges the masculine subject or the feminine other, that is, rather than determining Levinas's status as patriarchal or feminist, depending upon which figure is given priority in his early philosophical works, I'd like to concede that while Beauvoir is right that a strongly patriarchal world informs Levinas's language, his metaphors, some of which are more shocking than others, it is only when we look at his later work, specifically Otherwise Than Being, that we can begin to imagine a feminist ethics or an ethical feminism that neither Levinas nor Beauvoir could fully articulate in their own work, perhaps due to the social, historical, religious, sexual, intellectual, and even epistemological confines of their time, but also of the intellectual and religious traditions to which they belonged, even those against which they battled. I won't propose a synthesis between the thinkers. Rather, I want to call into question the positing of the subject as a privileged category within the work of both philosophers and within ethical and political philosophy more broadly. To my mind, one of the most significant shifts that takes place in Otherwise Than Being is Levinas's distancing from the highly anthropomorphized other from his early work, the face of the other that issues the demand, thou shalt not kill, to the same, to which the same responds, and through its response becomes an ethically responsible subject, a subject only insofar as she or he is responsible for the other. In Otherwise Than Being, in contrast, written after and in many ways in response to Derrida's critique of his work in Violence and Metaphysics, which I do not have time to discuss here, Levinas deploys a new notion of the other within the same, or the other in me. And I'm quoting now from Otherwise Than Being. Responsibility for the other, going against intentionality and the will, which intentionality does not succeed in dissimulating, signifies not the disclosure of a given and its reception, but the exposure of me to the other, prior to every decision. There is a claim laid on the same by the other in the core of myself, the extreme tension of the command exercised by the other in me, over me, a traumatic hold of the other on the same, which does not give the same time to await the other. Through this alteration, the soul animates the object. It is the very pneuma of the psyche. The psyche signifies the claiming of the same by the other, or inspiration, beyond the logic of the same and the other, of their insurmountable adversity, end of quote. Interestingly, although Levinas clearly advances the notion of the subject, of the ethical subject that will stand at the center of his philosophy, and in this I agree with Gabriela Basterra's contention that Levinas's is an ethics of the subject, not of the other, as Bruno Bastils, Peter Hallward, and others have claimed, here the same is paradoxically characterized as an object animated by the other. The subject is described in different passages of Otherwise Than Being as a slave to the other, as a hostage to the other who breaks in like a thief. So far, the difference from the Hegelian frame still on display in Time and the Other is slight. Yet this other, this thief, this soul that animates the psyche object, that persecutes the same, is also characterized as that which is born by the maternal. That is, by a maternal subject, a subject persecuted by the other within, for which she is responsible. And I'm going to quote from Otherwise Than Being again, I think one last time. Sensibility is being torn up from oneself, being less than nothing, a rejection into the negative, behind nothingness. It is maternity, gestation of the other in the same. Is not the restlessness of someone persecuted, but a modification of maternity, the groaning of the wounded entrails by those it will bear or has borne? In maternity, what signifies is a responsibility for others, to the point of substitution for others, and suffering both from the effect of persecution and from the persecuting itself, in which the persecutor sinks. Maternity, which is bearing par excellence, bears even responsibility for the persecuting by the persecutor. End of quote. Here, I believe, we arrive at the crux of our problem. The metaphorics of maternity is marshaled at precisely the moment that Levinas introduces a complex variation on the concept of subject. We can no longer decide between the masculine subject or the feminine other. The subject, the ethical subject, is that which is always already feminine. It is the maternal subject that bears an other within the same. So yes, Sika is correct when she urges us to remember that metaphors matter. And yes, the feminine maternal here becomes a kind of theme. It is thematized, and thematization is precisely what Levinas understands to be violence against the other. Yet, as Perpich reminds us, for the late Levinas, in which ethical experience is instantiated through language, ethical responsibility dwells within a paradoxical simultaneity of thematization and that which is unthematizable. This does not mean that we can completely dismiss Beauvoir's assertion that Levinas masculinizes the universal subject and feminizes the other for whom the subject is responsible. Rather, it means that this is not the only thing that Levinas does with metaphors of femininity. Let us return to Beauvoir, to the words that open the second sex and this essay. For a long time, I have hesitated to write a book on woman. The subject is irritating, especially to women, and it is not new. End of quote. The subject is irritating. Certainly, she must have meant the topic. Certainly, she aimed to convey that a book that treated the theme of women would be an irritating book. Beauvoir knew that gender was a social construct and that there was no such thing as the eternal feminine, just as there was no such thing as the Black soul or the Jewish character. However, simply because one can dismantle biological essentialism does not mean one has solved the problem. Beauvoir. To decline to accept such notions as the eternal feminine, the Black soul, the Jewish character, is not to deny that Jews, Negroes, women exist today. This denial does not represent a liberation for those concerned, but rather a flight from reality, end of quote. But perhaps the subject is also irritating. This might incline us to believe that the category of the subject, firmly framed in familiar Hegelian terms, is no longer operational for ethical and political philosophy. Think of Jean-Luc Nancy's What Comes After the Subject, or Alberto Moreiras's Non-Subject of the Political in Línea de Sombra. Moreover, we might insist that a companion concept of subjectivity, recognition, be submitted to careful scrutiny, as Patchen Markel, Bound by Recognition, argues, in Bound by Recognition. Zakiya Iman Jackson also argues something along similar lines in Becoming Human, and Rizvana Bradley, Amber Musar, and others have, in a like manner, sought to kind of move away from the categories of recognition that inform humanistic concepts of subjectivity and otherness. At the same time, irritation is or can be productive. Think oysters and pearls. Nothing happens to a subject, Derrida reminds us in The Politics of Friendship, his critique of sovereignty and sovereign decisionism. This does not necessarily mean that the category subject is to be wholly abandoned. Perhaps, in fact, it means that it needs to be rethought as irritating, that is, as open to and as opening up what happens. Perhaps, albeit without quite being able to articulate it, both Beauvoir and Levinas sought a new model for subjectivity, or an alternative to subjectivity, one that would not be grounded in self-identity, in sovereign decisionism, essentialism, or violence over the other, and which would entail other others than the reflexively constituted other, big O. If this is so, then our task today is to carry on this work, taking up the demands of Beauvoir's and Levinas's oeuvre and pushing the philosophy of the subject into irritation, exasperating it, taking it to its limit. I want to suggest as a mode of conclusion that it is through the mutual exposure of Levinas to Beauvoir and Beauvoir to Levinas that we can arrive at, or at least begin to embark upon, such an intellectual pursuit. Neither through a choice nor a compromise between thinkers, but rather by holding the radical demand of each in tension with the other. Viewed from this methodological vantage point, we can state that Beauvoir exposes the patriarchal assumptions in Levinas, and that Levinas, or a reading of Levinas after Beauvoir, a Levinas exposed to Beauvoir, expands the possibility of thinking and ethics beyond subjectivity, and consequently of a feminism beyond subjectivity. Such exposure is mutual and simultaneous, or rather the exposure of Levinas to Beauvoir and Beauvoir to Levinas allows for the possibility of an unsettling, a critique that will always already have taken place. The one will always already have been solicited or shaken by the other will have crept into the one, and the one will have borne responsibility for the other, neither universalist, nor identitarian, nor essentialist, but traumatically and irritatingly ethical and feminist. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, for a non-irritating paper, what a powerful paper. And now it's the turn for Penelope Deutscher. Hi, Penny. So Penelope Deutscher is Joanne and Sarah Harrison Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Associate Director of the Critical Theory Cluster at Northwestern University. She's the author of a number of works in the areas of contemporary and 20th century French philosophy, biopolitics, and gender and sexuality studies, including Yielding Gender, Feminism, Deconstruction, and the History of Philosophy, A Politics of Impossible Difference, the latter work of Luz Irigaray, How to Read Derrida, The Philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir, Ambiguity, Conversation, Resistance, and most recently, Foucault's Futures, A Critique of Reproductive Reason. Today, she's gonna share with us her paper, Paradoxes of Reproduction, Grammars of Power. Penny, please. I cannot hear you. No. It might be the volume because you don't seem to be muted, but it might be the volume.
Penny, you might have, you might need to change your output if you're wearing your headphones. That's happened to me. Like you have to tell the computer what source.
May I suggest that we go on to Karen's paper?
Yes.
And Penelope? Yes. What I would, can you hear me, Penelope? What I would suggest is that you completely leave the meeting, restart your computer, and then re-enter, and then we'll listen to Karen's paper, and then you can close the session. Does that sound okay?
Yeah. Okay, then. So now we're gonna hear Karen Banesra. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly? I'm sorry if I didn't. So Karen Benesra teaches in the Department of Modern Languages and Comparative Literature at Baruch College, CUNY, and will begin a junior professorship in art theory and critique at Leuphana University of Lumberg next fall. She's the author of Dematerialization, Art and Design in Latin America, and has edited and introduced a volume of scholarly essays on the topic of accumulation and subjectivity in Latin America, which is forthcoming with Sunny Press. Karen is currently working on 2 book-length research projects, one examining the concept of popular art in the 20th century Argentina, and another examining the relationship between property and the ethnicity of the collective in Latin American social and political thought from the 1960s to the present. Karen has co-edited the journal Art Margins since 2012 and is organizing a special issue on popular art to appear in 2023. Today, she's going to share with us her paper, Sexual Difference or the Desire to Change It All. Karen, please.
Thank you so much. I'm relieved that I don't have to be the last paper now, and Penelope's is rightly the last paper. I just wanted to begin, as others have, by thanking Erin for organizing this and the number and all of these very productive meetings, especially last March when everything was absolutely awful. And this was really sort of light in the sort of terrible months of last spring. And also I wanted to thank Kendra Atkinson, who's been working alongside Erin in organizing these encounters and the bibliography and the website. And I also, I'll say that the incoherent questions I've been asking over the last couple of days, you might find them resonance here. So if they made no sense, hopefully they'll make a bit more sense here. So how does sexual difference stand with the critique of accumulation? Since the 1960s, 2 different, if at times overlapping lines of thought have tried to address this question. One emerging in the context of Italian workerism in the 1970s, perhaps most notably in the work of Maria Rosa da Costa, Carla Lonzi, Selma James, and Silvia Federici, and another in the context of Anglophone socialist feminism in the work of Heidi Hartman, Iris Young, and Lise Vogel, among others. If the question at the heart of Marxist feminism, or more specifically social reproduction theory, concerns the role that household work or the production of labor power plays in the reproduction of capital, the formulations of and responses to this question are many. In more recent years, the equally hybrid theoretical and conjunctural interventions proffered under the rubrics of social reproduction theory and of the commons have underscored ways that women's oppression traverses and articulates the ethical and material relations of collective life under contemporary capitalism. Theorists and activists like Rita Segato and Silvia Federici again thus bring into question the nature at stake in the extraction of wealth, alternately through the export of natural resources and the codification and financialization of conventionally feminine forms of knowledge, work, and sociability. If, in their view, history has begun to question the secondary nature of the second sex, how shall we then name the specifically feminine nature of the subject produced through this process? Argentinian sociologist Veronica Gago has been at the forefront of this kind of conjunctural political analysis and social theoretical inquiry. In her prologue to a recent edition of Lonzi's Let's Spit on Hegel from 1970, Gago places Lonzi's appreciations of Hegel's Antigone in a genealogy leading up to contemporary accounts like Gago's own, of the reformulation of social and political collectivity practiced by feminist or women-led movements over the last 2 decades in Latin America in particular. For Lonzi, Antigone's refusal to participate in a culture defined by a masculine universal serves as an exemplary act of feminist rebellion. Putting aside the merits and limitations of Lonzi's approach, Gago's framing is significant in its own right. Whereas Lonzi reclaims the passive nature and ethical, particular familial political position that Hegel assigns to woman, Gago suggests that recent history itself reframes the stakes of the relation between the particular and the universal, community and state. What follows is an attempt to signal how Gago's most recent book, or maybe she published another one since I wrote this like a few months ago, her recent book, La Potencia Feminista o el Deseo de Cambiarlo Todo, first published in Spanish in 2019, effectively unfolds a feminine logic of desire in its account of the politics of the women's strike, but obviates this same question when formulating the social ontology of extractivism. As I will remark on below, one finds this logic embedded in the book's title, Verso published an English translation in 2020 under the title Feminist International, How to Change Everything. However, the title could be rendered more precisely and less elegantly as Feminist Power or the Desire to Change It All. I will return to the relevance of the all or totality referenced in the title a bit later on. For now, I would like to clarify that rather than elaborating a criticism of Gago's use of one theoretical framework over another, my hope is to underscore the extent to which the issue of defining the specifically feminine logic of desire is skewed in Gago's account reveals a problem in reality and in theory. What ultimately interests me in this sense is how we might define the material and ethical relations specific to the novel spaces and potential institutions of feminine labor and sociality that Gago describes. This proposal builds upon Gago's own intuitions about the expedience of non-capitalist forms of labor and property for capital by suggesting that a more formal approach to femininity might allow us a more historically concrete grasp on the dynamics of contemporary accumulation. Gago argues for an expanded understanding of extractivism, extending the conventional meaning in her larger body of work, extending the conventional meaning of the term beyond the agricultural and mineral export economies of the former colonial world. Gago repurposes the word in order to refer to contemporary forms of accumulation via rent. The latter includes both personal debt and the financialization of networks of mutual aid and exchange in the informal economy. In the author's words, La Potencia Feminista explores the politicization of social reproduction in the context of the cyclical crises of accumulation, and with it, in her words, the historical affinity between feminist and popular economies, end quote. Gago argues that the strike presents both a way of organizing social and political collectivity and a heuristic lens. In her view, the strike renders visible the implication among the phenomena of femicide, the frailty of conventional forms of masculine authority, and the exacerbated precarity of an already uneven regime of salaried labor. Gago describes the logic of the women's strike alternately as a transversal line cutting across different struggles, and as a body or body territory produces the contingent relations among heterogeneous forces. Her analysis ultimately ties together the social and political registers of the women's strike through recourse to a certain neo-Spinozist notion of the body as both the object of the expropriation of wealth and the genesis of a desiring force capable of resisting the same operation. In this way, Gago's militant, what she refers to as the militant investigation, insists on the relevance of accumulation to the ontology of politics. And yet, as it concerns the women's strike, it does so precisely by obviating sexual difference in the expropriation of labor power in the expanded sense that the author intends. The question at stake in my brief intervention is thus how we might conceive of a specifically feminine doing with the common stuff, or what we might name in a psychoanalytic register as the enjoying substance or jouissance constitutive of these trans-individual relations. What concerns me in this sense is less the possibility of translating between a Spinozist and Lacanian ontology or non-ontology than the effects of this analytical shift might produce. What might it mean to consider the expropriation of feminine labor, not only in terms of passions and affects, but of a disposition towards others or towards the lingering effects of what Gago refers to as the quote unquote first expropriation, and Lacan names as the imaginary loss of the phallus. Or inversely, how might recourse to a psychoanalytic understanding of the relationship of the parts of the whole help us to distinguish more clearly between the historical scene of enclosure or dispossession that Marx describes in the chapters in Capital and Primitive Accumulation, and the logic of capitalist accumulation as one structured by its necessary relation to historical forms of property outside of itself. For Gago, paraphrasing Rosa Luxemburg, it is the process of the strike itself that thinks and reveals the limitations of the liberal juridical categories assumed by earlier moments of feminism. And yet it is also with respect to the issue of property in its economic and legal dimensions where Gago's text vacillates. Stated slightly differently, La Potencia Feminista equivocates in its own theoretical, that is, external contemplative relation to the strike, and does so precisely where the material and legal relation of property pertains to the expropriation of feminine labor, sociality, and knowledge. Gago's observations on the practices and even informal reflections emerging from women's strike attest, in the author's words, to its creativity, or what we might understand as its capacity for redefining the meaning and scope of the women's movement. Indeed, one of Gago's main contentions is that the assemblies that preceded the strike transformed a demand for the recognition of feminine work into the conduit for the historical crisis of salaried labor, and for a certain modality of desire that would seem to surpass the strictures of the individual legal and moral subject, or the individual conceived as a legal and moral subject. The body of this desire, or the institutional form to be assumed by socialism, or a socialized rather than historical communal form of property, figures as something like the regulative idea structuring Gago's account of the women's strike. For the same reason, one could argue that criticizing her for this is unfair. To name this future horizon is to abandon struggle to the realm of literary utopia. Of course, it is also worth noting that Lacan, whose logical approach to feminine sexuation I have suggested as an alternative, or I will suggest as an alternative path for thinking about the historical logic of financial and natural extractivism, also failed to conceptualize the contours of a collective born of this same feminine logic. This is a shortcoming or absence made all the more notable by the extent to which, in the last years of his seminars, the feminine position came to define the subject's relation to the dominant social link and the potential outcome of analysis. My criticism is not that Gago fails to name the impossible and still inexistent object of feminine desire in the context of the strike, but rather that despite the text's frequent allusions to such a desire, not least in the book's own title, the book fails to consider its place in the dynamics, the place of this desire in the dynamics of accumulation. There, where Gago's account treats the social organization of labor subjected to and produced by extractivism in the sense outlined above, it also erases what might be specifically feminine about this subject. To the extent that it insists on linking contemporary forms of accumulation to contemporary forms of mass politics, La Potencia Feminista also invites us to ask how the logic of feminine sexuation might bear on both or either. It is perhaps worth noting that Lacan defines the sexes or sexual difference as propositions rather than descriptions. Abandoning the way that we might intuitively think of masculinity or femininity as predicates or characteristics common to different individuals, Lacan instead defines them as arguments or enunciative positions with respect to the phallic function. He states that the masculine position traces a field of desire defined by the submission of all subjects to this prohibition except for one. By contrast, he proposes that the feminine position admits that while no one is exempt from the imaginary and symbolic effects of the phallus, woman's desire is quote unquote not all or not wholly defined by this relation to the cultural remnants of the one or the primal father. This means that when seen from the feminine side of Lacan's graph of sexuation, being includes the division or exceptionalism against which the masculine position defines the same field in a negative fashion, or through the exclusion of one, through the demarcation of an impossible position. Whereas the transcendental figure of the father defines the finite nature of the set of all men and determines the identity of each of its members as individuals, no symmetrical ideal or transcendental mother exists for woman. Whereas the set of all men may accommodate a hypothetically unlimited number of members and thus reconstitute its totality at each turn, the set of not all women operates as an actual infinity with no totality or closure. Gago's portrayal of the women's strike illustrates the logical relation of the parts of the whole that Lacan associates with the organization of feminine desire. What might first appear as bombastic or excessive in the book's subtitle, The Desire to Change It All, is indeed intentional. It functions in order to name a collective subject as this desiring action. The todo, all, and in the deseo de cambiarlo todo, might also remind readers of the phrase que se vayan todos in the 2001 rallying cry for the resignation of each and every one of the politicians responsible for the country's monetary policy, a call widely noted for the fact that it was voiced among the traditionally liberal sectors of a newly impoverished urban middle class. Both slogans demand a complete change. Indeed, the disgust with elected officials and the call to remove each and every one is one possible outcome of the desire to change everything, but perhaps not the only one, as the experience of the women's strike suggests. Though she does not draw upon Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, the desiring force at stake in Gago's account could be said to unfold a feminine relation to the conflictivity or inconsistency of the social. She invites us to understand the all at stake in the subtitle of La Potencia Feminista, not as a utopian proposition, a mystical beyond of the present state of things, but rather in a way closer to the mathematical infinity of feminine jouissance as a set from which there can be no subtraction or addition. The expression of that logic in negotiating the very practice of a women's strike suggests a similarly feminine treatment of Ernesto Laclau's theory of hegemony. And this is in a sense baked into some of the larger theoretical and political project that Gago and others advance. We might recall in this sense how, in Unpopular Reason, Laclau proposes catachresis as the operation that defines politics. According to this formulation, the quote-unquote hegemonic operation by which a new collectivity comes into being ex nihilo does so through an act of naming, or more precisely, of proposing a signifier capable of standing in for quote-unquote a fullness which is constitutively absent. Adopted from Lacan's formulation of the phallic signifier, the signifier that represents this new collective subject does so both as the stand-in and supplement for a void, insofar as it also defines the whole or the all of the field of politics. In Laclau's model, the equivalence of difference, that is, the articulation and transformation of heterogeneous identities and demands, depends on a political space defined negatively by the enemy it excludes. The same negative definition of the field of politics also circumscribes the purported indeterminacy of the signifier or ideal organizing the symbolic space of politics. By contrast, in Gago's account, the capacity of the strike to hegemonize, that is, to define and transform the meaning of diverse demands and identities, emerges from a freer or more indeterminate form of indeterminacy. There is something undefined in the very notion of the women's strike that not only makes it an empty signifier to be filled with the contingent content of different struggles, but rather one that proves its plasticity by proposing a way of signifying the non-coincidence between the legal subject of alienated labor and the trans-individual subjects assumed under contemporary capital. Gago draws our attention to the fact that the discourse of the strike incorporated and transformed the liberal framework of victimhood and reparations associated with the protest against gender violence. She thus makes the following observation. Here's a quote from her. The strike makes explicit why certain forms of work correspond to a given sexual division of labor. It is in this sense that the women's strike is both a labor strike and an existential strike, end quote. With the idea of the existential strike, Gago underscores the extent to which feminine labor and property exceed the mere demand for recognition within the categories of liberal political economy or its critique. The author's anecdotal examples take, for instance, the suggestion to serve raw meat instead of cooked food on the day of the strike, aim to render visible the kinds of reproductive tasks typically naturalized or ignored by bourgeois morality and the industrial workers' movements historically. However, as Gago points out, the aims of the women's strike of 2017 transcend those of an earlier generation in that they not only wish to draw attention to and thus denaturalize feminine labor, but to question and historicize the very limit between labor as an alienable good for sale and labor as an activity embedded within the ethical and material relations of a collective. Extending Gago's analysis, the women's strike not only thinks the historical political conjuncture of neoliberalism or its mechanisms of expropriation through rent, it also thinks the very category of property in historical and ontological terms. The idea of the existential strike speaks to this point. Perhaps the objective of the strike is not to reveal the empirical existence of women or their work, but rather its inexistence in the legal order of capitalism. Rather than defining itself against the existence of the wage relation, Gago's existential strike points to the inexistence of something like a feminized form of property within the property relations of capitalism. In doing so, it also questions the conceptual limitations of capitalism as a purportedly or tangentially uniform mode of production. In what I have presented, I have both tried to underscore the feminine logic or political organization at stake in Gago's highly original account of the women's strike, and through its extension to posit a way of thinking about feminine labor beyond a merely descriptive function of the feminine. Instead, and in a very inchoate way still, I have tried to work through my own interest in mobilizing Lacan's logical approach to feminine desire as a way of thinking about how material and ethical relations become intertwined as sites of accumulation and its subversion under capital. A Lacanian approach to the feminine in feminized labor might serve as the starting point for considering the historical specificity of Gago's expanded notion of extractivism and the subject produced through it. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So now we hear you, Penny.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. As well.
Great. So
yeah.
Go ahead.
All still well, yes. Great. So I wanted first of all to thank Erin so very much for holding us together through this time. I remember that the very first Zoom meeting I ever had was actually with Erin and everybody in the first meeting of the Women in Theory forum in Zoom. And I think there's been times where it seemed quite difficult to sort of think or to write. And as a number of us have said, Erin has really mobilised that possibility of thought for a group of us through this time in a really extraordinary way. So thank you very much, both to Kendra, of course, for organisation and Erin for organisation, but also for that, that extra. This paper follows on very well from the other two in this session in that it also rethinks the resources of forms of theory that we are inhabiting, but perhaps coming to think differently. And in my case, I have continued to think with Foucault, but I am reading some work from the paper that's being included in the collective projects here. I'm reading from that project material that thinks through Foucauldian resources differently. And the way that I think through the Foucauldian resources differently is partly in line with the emergence of multiple forms of power that have emerged from the lectures by Foucault and the different forms of power included in Collège de France lectures. So how have we started to rethink certain understandings of power as those forms of power multiplied with the publication of his lectures? And the second thing I'm thinking that through with is the move towards necropolitics as a post-Foucauldian form of thought that expanded a necropolitical dimension of Foucault's biopolitics. So those are the two things that I'm rethinking, and I'm doing it today just in terms of what that might mean for a grammar of power. And this is just to speak to a part of the paper that's in question. So the passage I wanted to come back to is a passage that will be very familiar to you all, that there's no power that's exercised without a series of aims and objectives. And that's, of course, a passage from Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1. And as you know, that statement becomes important because of what follows, but this does not mean that it results from the choice or the decision of an individual subject. I have been returning to that statement differently, not in terms of that focus on the question of whether thinking about power without aims and objectives is importantly an alternative to thinking about power in relation to the choice of an individual subject, but instead in the company of post-Foucauldian theorists who've been interested in looking back at Foucault in terms of, as I said, a multiplicity of forms of power. And from that perspective, then thinking about how those aims and objectives are going to look different at the point at which those forms of power multiply. That's to say, if different forms of power have different ends and different tactics and different strategies, then when they multiply, how are we therefore inhabiting at the same time the different strategies and tactics of multiple forms of power? That's basically the problem that I'm speaking to when I think about a grammar of power. The lexicon of power that I'm speaking to is one that, with the publication of Foucault's Collège de France lectures, included sovereign forms of power, the disciplinary, regulatory, the biopolitical, the securitizing, the governmental, neoliberal governmentality, and then, of course, in the wake of Foucault's work, further forms of power, which would include, just to name a few, the thinking of bare life, of indebted governmentality, and so on. And so sometimes those are thought of as alternatives, forms of power, or perhaps forms of power that might have replaced each other. Sometimes they're thought of as relationalities. So the reason I want to go back to this very famous phrase from Foucault, that there's no power without a series of aims and objectives, and that power relations are imbued through and through with calculation, is then, as I've suggested, to think about the relationship between those calculations when they're multiple. So my two suggestions are, first of all, that post-Foucauldian theory has dug deeper in thinking together the multiplicity of forms of power, and that doing so, thinking the multiplicity of those intersections has been part of many post-Foucauldian theorizations of the biopolitical as the necropolitical, where the necropolitical would be optimizing the life of some, which takes the form of distributing forms of death indirectly or otherwise for others. So the argument is going to be that different forms of power might have correspondingly different aims, objectives, and techniques. Those won't always aim, therefore, won't always align, therefore, and they might be contradictory. And if so, that might be understood as a form of critique between them, a kind of auto-critique or imminent critique within them, within their aims and within their forms, so that their forms and their aims would start to enter into a direct dialogue with each other. So then my question is what the relationship is between the contradictory aims that arise from a coincidence of multiple forms of power and the necropolitical dimensions of that coincidence. And the 5 questions that I want to ask for a possible post-Foucauldian grammar of power correspond to reflecting on the forms, strategies, and techniques of those different types of power as they coordinate together. Asking how different bodies come to be inhabited at once by different forms of embodiment, with the argument that different forms of embodiment and different multiplicities correspond to those forms of power. Just to give one example, as when the body is moralized in individual terms, but also in terms of its possible relation to a population or a people or a nation or a future. So how do we inhabit both of those bodies at once? And as I've been saying, how do we give attention to the fact that those bodies are sometimes conflictual or contradictory in their form or their aim or their tactics and so on. And so that's a way of rethinking what the resources of Foucault would be in a post-Foucauldian moment. And I'll just say that a particular interest in the project has been to do so in relation to the politics of reproduction, again, as individualised, moralised, and also, of course, as thought at the level of population in terms of national futures and so on. So the 5 questions I'm asking within the grammar of power, and that'll just be the structure of what I present, is first of all, what terminology is used to theorise how different forms of power articulate together. And here I'll say that a growing literature has variously preferred, and just to give some examples, from Alex Wahalia, relationality, from Foucault and also Beauvoir, interpenetration, from Beauvoir, co-constitution, seesawing and toggling, from Badiouan, interdependency and operational mingling, from Jackson, a kind of mutual enforcing, from Foucault and also Loic, the compatibility and complementarity of forms of power, also from Weinbaum, their contesting and shifting constellations, their paradoxical coexistence, their polymorphous relation, from Warren, conjunctions that mutually modulate, accentuate and attenuate, Badiouan or Valencia, Gore capitalism's contradictory conjunctions. So that's to give a sense of the breadth of theory and the zones of theory which would be engaging that problem of how different forms of power, many of which are pegged to Foucauldian resources, even in a post-Foucauldian moment, how those relations of power are understood to connect with what terminology. The second question is how forms of power are understood to intersect. That's to say, how do they do so? So far I've had the terminology, and secondly, what is that relationship? So just to start with a simple and important example, if biopower is rethought as presupposing histories of subordination, making differentially vulnerable the bodies that are available for collective forms of management. So that would be an intersection between forms of power, and the one form would presuppose the other if biopower presupposes a differential vulnerability that's already in place. So for that argument, you'd turn to Wahalia or you could turn to Jarek. And so I'd be saying that sometimes the one form of power is the condition of the other, and sometimes the one form could be presented as another means of realising another. So to turn to, say, Loic on the relationship between sovereign power and biopolitical interest in abortion, Loic would argue that the emergence of biopower didn't result in sovereign forms of power withdrawing from women's bodies, but rather in the state's biopolitical interest in stimulating certain forms of reproduction and also in regulating access to abortion. So to think more about the how of that articulation, biopolitics could be understood to expand a sovereign scope of potential destruction. So for example, biopolitical governmentality might articulate differently with sovereign forms of power so as to expand the latter's scope. And one example there might be Mbembe's necropolitics, just one version of that, where he'll discuss, say, a deliberate attack by sovereign power on infrastructure that's associated with a biopolitics of quality of life. So that might be an attack on targeting hospitals, or a war of terror on schools, or the inhibition of reliance on safe passage, or the destruction of roads or electricity supply or infrastructure. And there, the biopolitical would have expanded the scope of what then could be available for sovereign destruction. And that will be a way of thinking about two forms of power as hinging together, to think about how they interconnect. Or in a sense, to think about that example in reverse. Again, asking how these forms of power can be understood to intersect. Another example from Beauvoir in the reverse would be when a sovereign form of power expresses a right to maim a population, or when a right to maim a population expresses a form of sovereign power, but in doing this, what's produced is a debilitated population, which is then made available for an extension of biopolitical administration. So again, the one form of power is extending the terrain of the other. Again, on the question of the how, another example of a coordinated articulation of forms of power would be when, say, the biopolitical is understood to expand the scope of sovereign authority. So here we might think about how biopolitical concern can be a pretext for a sovereign form of power that's presented as restraint. And here again, I could mention Beauvoir's account of the sovereign right to maim, and the articulation between forms of power might be seen when the guise of humanitarianism accomplishes a retroactively projected form of sovereign power that would have had the authority to kill, but it putatively refrains from doing so, instead shooting to maim. And on her argument, the articulation together of at least two forms of power would be that the one is organised by a putative concern for life, the other for the appropriation of bodies and territories, and what's created is an effect of sovereign moderation, as if there was an unused greater sovereign capacity to kill that was not exercised. And that authority to kill, which is projected as having not been exercised by way of a putatively biopolitical concern, is, just one second. Yeah, there's a surreptitious assertion of the authority to be more deadly. So the scope of an authority is projected retrospectively by what seems to be a biopolitical refraining. Or again, to talk about the coordinated coincidence of forms of power as contradiction, we could think of this as a tactical paradoxicality, as when sovereign, disciplinary and biopolitical tactics might coordinate to seemingly recognise freedom, to promote it and to render it impossible, and to brutalise some of its supposed bearers in coordination. And that coordination could be thought of as a tactical paradoxicality. That's to say the forms of power might seem to be paradoxical, but that paradoxicality itself could act as a particularly lethal form of domination. So that might combine, if we turn to the work of Hartman, with an account of disciplinary techniques of moral individualisation that then contribute to deflecting the locus of responsibility away from those structural conditions that you could also understand in terms of sovereign forms of power and other forms of power. And here, in terms of thinking about that articulation, then you could understand those forms of power as reinforcing each other. So the way that forms of power might mutually reinforce is that they could be contradictory, they could be paradoxical, or they could be mutually reinforcing insofar as they produce a contradictory and paradoxical form. You could argue that that's seen in Warren's work on paradox, and also in Hartman's work on burdened individuality. So here I might just mention from Sense of Subjection, on the one hand, the account of disciplinary techniques of a good conduct of freedom that will be promoted for putatively freed men and women, that's combined with a promotion of family values and good household management. So that disciplinary form, that's epitomised by the circulation of freedmen's manuals, as she's arguing, as teaching tools for the use of freedom seemingly delivered by abolition. And then freedom is moralised in terms of fault for its poor conduct or putatively poor conduct, at the same time as structural conditions are in place that are making it near impossible to achieve. That's combining with mechanisms of sovereign power. So let's say the criminalisation of vagrancy, incarceration for disorderliness, the breaking of job contracts, or say so-called disrespect, so the possibilities of incarceration for those forms or forms of extreme violence. And so Hartman argues an account of how the extractive forms of sovereign power will conjoin with the disciplinary techniques of power that reroute responsibility for racial domination to that burdened individual. So it's just sort of adding to a number of contemporary theorists, as I'm thinking of it, that are thinking through a kind of a grammar of power in a number of ways. If I then compared, say, Bargu and Hartman on this point, then that might be to compare, say, biosovereignty for Bargu and burdened individuality for Hartman. From Bargu, we might have an account of how there's a new terminology for forms of power that operate specifically at the intersection of multiple forms of power, which is an argument that Bargu presented and stuff and enumerate that we should understand a particular form of power as the intersection of multiple forms of power, and the term that she recoins to that end is biosovereignty. And I might just put that in dialogue with Hartman's burdened individuality, where a form of racial domination is accomplished at the intersection of multiple forms of power, and through that particularly vicious combination of sovereign forms of domination and terror, individualizing disciplines, biopolitical responsibilization, and racism's aversive securitizing. That brings me to the third in the 5 questions I have for a grammar of power, a post-Foucauldian grammar of power. Some forms of analysis have seen it as important to accomplish these grammars, not by seeing historical forms of power as replacing each other, but as coordinating. And so, again, how are forms of power understood to intersect? And then that would move me to 4. Insofar as the embodiments and the techniques and the aims of different forms of power will overlap in the space of what might appear to be one and the same body, then how does that impact a capacity to theorize resistance to those forms of power? And I'll just say that again, insofar as the embodiments, techniques, and aims of different forms of power will overlap in the space of what appears or could appear to be one and the same physiological body, how does that impact a capacity to theorize resistance to those forms of power? So here are 2 contrasting views. On the one hand, Bargu on biosovereignty, on the way that multiple forms of power combine. So if we think about the intersection of forms of power as a biosovereignty, then she suggested we think of resistance, for example, necro-resistance, as a form of insurgency that reappropriates or transforms the life and the death that biosovereignty otherwise would distribute or dispose of. And so she mentions, in that sense, struggle by agents who take into their hands the power of and over death to contest the power of and over life. And her examples would include some forms of hunger striking, of self-immolation, and here I'd add also, say, Sanyal and her work on detained, undocumented immigrants who resist biopolitical identification through self-mutilation of fingerprints. And in both of those cases, those are forms of insurgency understood, to use that expression from Bargu, as something taken into one's own hands, with Sanyal giving a very literal account of that, in a sense. But those specific forms of resistance to a coordination of multiple aims of power needn't only and always be understood in terms of that taking into one's own hands and that particular understanding of insurgency that Bargu suggests. And I wanted to end by suggesting some interesting forms that could be thought otherwise. In the work of Bargu herself, she herself mentions instances of women's suicide bombing, for example, if formulated in terms of marriage with a militant cause, then that could be seen as at once, she argues, affirming and subverting gender roles, where that could be understood as a conflict of tactics of power between the forms taken by the self-sacrifice expected in biopolitical terms of the wife and mother, and the form taken by the sovereign type of power that assumes her subordination. And it could be said that the one aim conflicts with the other, whether or not that's the overt project of that particular form of insurgency. So again, one form would come into conflict with the second form and engage in a critical dialogue without that necessarily being the project of the agent in question. And that's to take some examples which would pull against the real desire in Bargu's work to retain the notion of necro-resistance for reflective or agent-based insurgency. So thinking about biopolitics and reproduction as an intersection of different embodiments might then allow us to say, on the one hand, that the contemporary state is assumed to protect the rights of citizens understood as a whole, and to do that, it differentially disposes of their lives. That there's another mode of life that's in play when that combines with a biopolitical project to optimise those lives, but by introducing a cut between who shall live and who shall die. That another life again is in play when there are trends in populations that are understood as differentially valuable or as problematically toxic. And so my question there in terms of the different forms of life that correspond to different forms of power is, again, what is not a form of embodiment that occupies all of those forms of life and death and more besides, and how do those multiple forms of embodiment that coincide in one body then become forms that are in this critical dialogue? So the fifth question for my grammar of power is exactly that. How might the conflicting directions in which seemingly one and the same body is pulled count already as critical dialogue or as form of critique, so a body as critique? How might the conflicting directions in which seemingly one and the same body is pulled by these multiple forms of life that are occupied, multiple multiplicities that one is occupying because of different forms of power, one's concurrently occupying the different lives, the different bodies, the different multiplicities, so, and the different aims. And as those aims conflict and a body is pulled in different directions accordingly, how can those pulls count as critical dialogue without that necessarily being the kind of insurgency that, say, Badiouan has had in mind? I've suggested three ways of thinking about this in the differences between, say, first, Badiouan on those agents who, again, to quote, take into their lives the power of and over death to contest the power of and over life. The second example I gave was the kind of action that affirms and subverts gender roles. But the third that I wanted to suggest was from Jackson's Becoming Human, where Zakia speaks to the differences in adult and infant mortality or the increased likelihood of cancer that are the biological effects of racism in the United States. And she does so by pointing out, quote, that biology's agency is not prior to or independent of the biopolitical order, but is embedded in biopolitical systems. So again, biology's agency is not prior to or independent of the biopolitical order, but embedded in biopolitical systems. So at one point in Becoming Human, she reads the toxic environments of anti-blackness, giving an account of bodily environments, not only as the passive recipients of power's effects, but again, to quote, as the very agency of the body producing the conditions of possibility for the racially disparate gutting of bodies by reproductive tumours and cancerous cells. When Jackson points out that maternal bodily systems can also become toxic agency, of course, that's not the resistance that's envisaged by Badiouan of agents who take into their hands the power of and over death to contest the power of and over life. But it is a further way of understanding how a critical embodiment's resistance can take the shape of its own conflicts of form. And so to that end, I wanted to end with a passage from Becoming Human that I found particularly intriguing in that respect. And I wanted to end with that. And then again, the recall of that very familiar passage from Foucault from 1976. So again, from Foucault, there's no power that is exercised without a series of aims and objectives, but that doesn't mean that it results from the choice or decision of an individual subject. And then the passage from Jackson's Becoming Human, where discussing the paradox and the contradiction and even the chaos of corporeal forms and states has emerged as a means of acknowledging them also in their forms of chaos, conflict, toxicity, to be critical and to be astute exactly in that form. And so I'm thinking of intelligent materiality or critical materiality. So from Foucault, there's no power that's exercised without a series of aims and objectives. And from Jackson, speaking to a predicament that she says might be described as chaos, a chaos by design that's used to marginalize Black gender and sexualities, as she uses this expression, power only takes direction, she argues, from its own shifting exigencies. And so those clashes can be understood as conflicting aims of power, and those conflicting aims of power can be understood as engaging each other critically and corporeally. So that's to give a sense of a distribution of theorists for whom Foucault is certainly not a guiding theorist in any way, but I think that something has happened to Foucault, that Foucault has been redeployed in terms of what I'm thinking of as a possible grammar of power. I don't think it's necessary to any of the theory that I've described here, but it's a way of thinking about what Foucauldian resources continue to be in a post-Foucauldian moment. And so just to reiterate the 5 questions for my grammar of power, what terminology is used to theorize how different forms of power articulate together, where I gave about 9-10 examples for those terminologies. How are forms of power understood to intersect? And insofar as the embodiments, techniques and aims of different forms of power are going to overlap in the space of what might appear to be one and the same body, how does this impact a capacity to theorize resistance to those forms of power? That was my 4th. And then 5th, how might the conflicting directions in which seemingly one and the same body be pulled with the sometimes results of chaos count already as critical dialogue? That's to say, a critical dialogue of forms of embodiment, forms of life, and perhaps forms of resistance with itself, that can be thought of as a form of insurgency and a form of the origins of creativity and transformation, which is different to the kind of insurgency that Sabagi would theorize. Thanks very much, and sorry for the technical difficulties.
Well, thank you very much, Erin, Karen, and Penelope. So now I think I can take questions from the panelists. I know that Valeria Campos has one for Erin. You want to go, Valeria?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Erin, for your paper. It was very, very inspiring as always. I have like a comment maybe to see what's your opinion on this. I think I will say that Beauvoir actually took Levinas' philosophy in general in a way that is not quite Levinasian, if you want to put it in that way. And I think this is because Beauvoir is analyzing, and this is a problem probably that has been solved from gender theory after Beauvoir. Beauvoir takes alterity only under the economy of opposition, right? Or inside the economy of opposition. So she cannot see, well, because Levinas is also not, as you say, not working this yet. She cannot see very well another logic, which I would call the logic of the substitution in Levinas, right? Because the logic of the substitution is what allows the metaphor of the mother. I really love to put this logic of substitution in eating, cannibal terms. So we can have like a cannibal ethic, right? Because substitution, the structure of the other in the self is a parasitological, it's like a parasite figure, right? So, well, and in this is the last, and in this sense, right, I think Levinas has to take the mem, how you call it in English, el mismo, in terms, in masculine, the same thing, in masculine terms. He has to take it like that, because this mem is the hierarchical element of an opposition, like the structure, like the paradigmatic way of, you know, taking the hierarchical term in an opposition relation. So what do you think about all this? It's like a conversation.
Thank you, Valeria. So I'm gonna take Natalie's question before I give the speakers time to answer. We have a little bit less than 20 minutes.
This question is for Penelope. Thank you for your talk. I was very much interested in two things that you said, right? How different bodies come to be taken over through different embodiments, and how certain bodies are pulled in conflicting directions. And that I felt like your paper was speaking to the first panel today, and even some of what we discussed yesterday, especially with Antigone, for example, embodying a type of male vulnerability in her frigidity, and who was I thinking about? Erin's paper on the feminine principle. Oh, and Julia's paper in particular on the differentiation, right, within Asianness. And one of the things that comes to mind is how, and this is thinking about Zakia's paper, how in these different directions and in these different embodiments, what emerges is a blackened humanity. And I'm wondering if you could comment a bit more on that. I'm not sure if my question makes sense.
No, it does, very much so, and thank you. So yes, there's a number of ways of thinking about the catachresis around woman, the feminine, woman and the feminine in relation to blackened humanity and the blackening of woman. And I'm interested in the difference between doing that in terms of, say, meaning, so the different meanings of woman versus you know, the makings of different forms of embodiment, where it has seemed to me that a language of power is especially useful for thinking about those conflicting forms of embodiment, because the language of power is so aim-oriented. And so to think about that as a conflict of forms of power is to think about that as a conflict of aims. I'm not saying it's the, and in doing that, of course, you've got a critical dialogue and an undermining, a concurrent undermining of those aims. So it's one of the reasons why I'd found the particular way that, as I understand it at least, and it's a question more than a statement, the way that the term chaos comes to be used in becoming human, you know, can be thought in those terms. So I'm not, to think about the conflict or the contradiction or the paradox of the word woman, or the catachresis of the word woman, the notion of gender and intersection with race in relation to bodies. It's not that you can't do that with many ways. And I don't know if it will be apparent that in no way am I trying to say that Foucault is like the best resource for doing that. It's just struck me as a particularly interesting resource because it offers a means of doing that via a language of power versus other languages. Let's say the language of affect, for example, where the language of power, because it's aim-oriented, gives you a conflict between the aims, and so a kind of critique of aims, that's to say an impeding of concurrent aims. So that's why I've been interested in doing it in that particular way. I don't know how that would intersect with the different meanings of the feminine and woman for sorry, the different meanings of being woman or not being woman for Antigone, but it's just to give a sense of why I think that the language of power becomes particularly useful. It's not much of an answer, but I guess it's a start.
No, it is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Penelope. And now I'm gonna take Anna's question. She has one question for Karen.
I do, yeah. Wait, did we get somehow out of order though? Do we have a question that got posed that didn't get answered for Erin? So I'm happy to ask a question to Karen, but Erin did get posed a nice question that didn't get.
Yes, please do place your question for Karen, and then I'm gonna have one more question for Erin from the Q&A, and then I'll give Karen and Erin time to answer.
Great. So it's really quick, Karen. I super appreciated your paper, but I kept tripping over your use of the word ethical. And I don't know if that, I just want you to tell us what you're using it for. It seemed like it was possibly a kind of Lacanian baggage, as it were. I say as a Lacanian, about the kind of effort to think the inexistence of women's labor vis-a-vis a non-capitalist form of collectivity. It seemed like it could have been a synonym for a dialectical account of like, what is the productivity of this unwaged labor? And so I just want to hear like, what's the term ethical doing for you in this interesting constellation of the critique of accumulation around feminine desire? That's it.
Okay, so now I'm going to read one question from the audience. Is Mia Duplessis, and the question is for Erin. It says, thank you for a fascinating paper. I'm wondering about the place of metonymy within metaphor and the way that metaphor is always, as it were, pregnant with metonymy. And I am wondering this especially because of the metonymic slippage within the metaphor of woman towards maternity, in which maternity seems to be a metonym for woman, and especially it seems for care and an ethical relation to otherness. I do understand that we are talking here about metaphor, but I am wondering to what extent this metaphor metonym does foreclose any thinking about figurative, literal women who are not mothers, among many others, trans women, literal figurative. In other words, the metaphor seems in advance to exclude some women, even from a metaphoricity of ethics, excluded from a conceptualization of theory of the ethical. And just, I just have one question for Penelope and Karen that I had actually prepared, because they both use the term extractivism in their papers in I think in different contexts, not in different sense, but different contexts. So before you I mean, Karen and Erin have the chance to answer, I wanna pose this question for Penny and Karen. So you both go over the term extractivism within the context of women's labor exploitation and neoliberalism. Penny, you mentioned that neoliberal choice as a perverse form of freedom ends up deflecting the locus of responsibility, as well as reproducing and even exacerbating racial domination. And Karen, you, through analyzing Gago's use of the term in La Potencia Feminista, you explained that the 2017 women's strike in Argentina disclosed the accumulation in neoliberalism through expropriation of feminine labor, sociality, and knowledge. So my question for both of you, or better, my petition, would be if you could add up a little bit more on the problem of the subject of a left or anti-liberal, anti-capitalist form of feminism, and especially of the demands and modes of organization that the shape of a feminism of the left would have to sculpture. What I have in mind is the different agency in Ni Una Menos and the Me Too. So one is a collective agency and the other one is a singular agency. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm sorry for a long question. So you want to go first, Erin?
Sure, unless someone else would like to go. So I think that Valeria and Mia's questions actually go really nicely together. So I would say that the way in which Valeria is working on cannibalism in her paper from today, but also more generally that I've heard on other occasions, allows us to think about the other within the same in a way that perhaps doesn't irritate us as much, because we're not worried kind of on behalf of, the cannibal community. We don't identify as, and we're not identified necessarily as literal cannibals, although I'm sure we've been accused of being figurative cannibals. And so it sort of doesn't tread on that much more complicated, thorny ground, which frankly, I've tried to avoid, I think precisely for this reason. I've never dealt with the figures of femininity or maternity in Levinas for precisely this reason. So Mia, I'm in complete agreement that it's extremely complicated, and that it by being problematic is no less interesting. So I think that it needs to be taken up precisely because it's so complicated, and to point to those exclusions, to point to what happens when metaphor swallows metonymy, or vice versa. I guess metonymy would be swallowing metaphor. I'm not sure which way, but I am completely uninterested, and historically have been completely uninterested in taking any one figure as kind of a model for ethics, right? I mean, I think nothing could be further from anything that I would ever argue than to say that, only women, or only the feminine, or only the maternal would be examples of a certain kind of ethical subjectivity. If anything, I've avoided those positions to a fault. In other words, I haven't been able to satisfactorily engage with those really thorny problems because I've been so allergic to how that sounds and what the implications are for historical material bodies, among other things. And so I guess, and in fact, I mean, this is something actually that we can take up in the final discussion, that's frankly, I think, why I avoided this whole thing to begin with. And I don't want to be too autobiographical, but I think that what these 2 days have shown is that one doesn't have to, in order to avoid what we call identitarianism, and we all probably have quite different ideas of what that means, that doesn't mean that we have to avoid these really tricky and sticky problems of kind of the gendering and sexuation of the thinkers and the concepts and the areas in which we work. So I feel that I probably under and over answered both questions, but I want to give some time to Karen and Penelope in our last 5 minutes.
Karen, you want to go?
Thank you. Thank you to Anna and to Rosada for the questions. So by ethical, I didn't have a super technical, or I was referring to the individual, the relationship among individuals, or the relationship of the individual to the collective, which is problematic because it assumes that the individual precedes the collective, right? And so I think what's at stake is certainly not pointing to Gago's account or wishing to find in the account or in the phenomenon itself some sort of existing ethics that we can follow or something like that, like a code, right? But rather what's at stake for like the ethics of psychoanalysis, right, in desiring, following desire beyond the law, is something that precedes that, is like assuming a position, right? Assuming the position of the experience of the non-fixity, right, of the law, right? Of assuming a non-normative position, right? A feminine or psychotic or perverse position, right? Privileging those positions, as Lacan does, right? Kind of fundamentally, as the sort of impetus behind, right? The formulation of an ethics of a psychoanalytic ethics. So I think that's sort of what's at stake in the, so my use is not a really technical use, it's really just a way of delimiting, maybe it's the problem of the collectivity or of the relation among individuals. I think that maybe what is behind that, and maybe I can try to link this to the issue of extractivism. I have this vague notion that some of these contemporary treatments of accumulation via rent, right, of the issue of social reproduction, and I think the treatment that Gago does is really exceptional in this work, and in the book that was based on her dissertation is very interesting because it really does this work of, without going through all of the debates that precede her, of positioning the thing itself, right, or of moving through certain situations, certain conjunctures, as a way of recasting the question of what is it that lies outside of or sort of intertwined with a salaried regime of labor and the kind of juridical and moral subject that it assumes, and says, well, this salary regime of labor was really never generalized in Latin America. It cannot be said to be generalized now. And so the outlier case, right, the extreme outlier case of like women's totally unpaid labor becomes now the case, right, for examining contemporary dynamics, both of how, contemporary forms of exploitation or of accumulation via rent, which is anything outside of salaried labor, change, really affect, right, the gender relations, the conception of sexual difference, and this is why she tries to tie together, the feminization of labor and say it's phenomena like femicide, right? And so I have this like notion that's not at all worked out, that these kinds of retreatments, some from the perspective of this seemingly outlier case, right, can give us a way into returning to this relationship between, say, the organization of relations among individuals insofar as they're organized by the moral law, right? And kind of and historical change in a way that was treated, say, by people like Claude Melissu in the 60s, right? But that was usually the topic of investigation for, say, anthropologists influenced by structural Marxism, but who are looking at pre-class societies, right? So somewhat simple, right? Societies in their work, in their sort of observations on kind of isolated or historical non-Western collectivities. And so I have this idea that this could help, that's work like by kind of rendering a bit more plastic or trying to push the limits of what's suggested in Gago's work could help us to think about the relevance of these sort of approaches to non-capitalist forms of property insofar as they're imbricated, right? As they're imbricated with questions of sexual difference, of the articulation of morality, right? And so that the way that I think about this in relation to extractivism is just expanding upon this question of expanding upon the importance of the kind of mega exploitation of natural resources, right? Thanks to the role that China plays, right, in the world economy, right? This kind of reinvestment, the extreme dependence of, say, Latin American economies on the extraction and exploitation of natural resources, which is always the case and is now kind of is taking a more extreme form, right? Thanks to sort of global economic dynamics, expanding this as Gago does to include forms of extraction of wealth through financialization of informal economies, right? And also to forms of sociability, right? Informal forms of sociability that also seem to go along with sort of feminine spaces. And so I think that that is what is at stake for her in her account of the Ni Una Menos movement, or the kind of conjuncture of movements that includes the Ni Una Menos movement that go into the strike. So not only is it collective, but it is collective in a way that poses a challenge, not only more than a challenge, like a novelty, right? Kind of novelty in the logic by which, or like an alternative to a sort of understanding of state-led populism, right? Of a kind of state-led political mobilization, right? Because part of what's at stake for Gago as a person, as an actor and as a thinker is, you know, defining how we can think of a mass politics outside, not necessarily outside of any form of institutionalization, but beyond what has been prescribed by the state, right? The state and its kind of more center-left forms in Argentina since the first Kirchner government.
Thank you, Karen. We have gone a little bit over time. So Penny, do you want to say something like in a minute or so?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to add on informal economics and sociability, I might add, say, Clara Han, an anthropologist, to the discussion, and her work on indebted economies in Chile, and the phenomenon of, let's say, a subject that produces an indebted population and then withdraws or decreases the welfare state, and then produces the informal economies that are, say, distributing and circulating medication in various cooperative ways, you know, which would go with the informal economics and Baroque economies that Gago's so interested in. And just to say that, you know, one of the ways of understanding you know, in terms of the paper I was presenting, I could think about that as the intersection again of those forms of power, you know, the biopolitical space that's created, and then that withdraws the forms of feminine care, which are reworked in certain kinds of ways when the sharing of resources of care and resources of medicine, a reconfiguration of what would have been a biopolitical expectation from the state, which has withdrawn. And then I guess just the point would be that the cooperation in question isn't just a cooperation, you know, between women, but it's also that the kinds of bodies that emerge and the ways in the kind of ways in which they're medicalized or not, or the medicine that's taken in those cases, or the physical state of a body is itself going to be the point of the intersection of the forms of power. So in addition to thinking about sociability and you know, the problems of organization and resistance, I guess I'd be wanting to think about how the forms of power themselves that are embodied are themselves already conflicting and in critical dialogue with themselves by the grammar they were suggesting, in a way that I think is sort of consistent with the response we've already heard.
Okay, so thank you, Penny. So this was the last panel, so we're gonna